I hope you're right where you are now. It's probably too late, but here I am, reaching my arm. I want us to win the struggle we're in. It's never goodbye. It's never goodbye till it's over. I hope you're still with me. This time will be different. Let's make a decision now. So come back to life. I was so crazy to lose you. Just come back to life. Let's not do what we used to. Life is a winding road, no telling where it goes. Driving through days and nights, won't stop for traffic lights. No, if I will ever figure out where the road goes, even if I'm falling down, I will keep on searching for my highs. You can say I lost my mind, I will keep on holding my head high, even if the sky is falling down. Jumping from cliffs so high, trusting our wings to fly. Sometimes we're crashing down, but we get up and start from the ground. And I really wanna know, if I will ever figure out where the road goes. Even if I'm falling down, I will keep on searching for my highs. You can say I lost my mind, I will keep on holding my head high. Even if the sky is falling down, the sky is falling, the sky is falling down. Even if the sky is falling down, the sky is falling, the sky is falling down. Water, where you will find peace. Take a step into the river, get down on your knees, up to the mountain. Well, take it in the view. You will find the life is greater than you. When you go in the storm, I will hold you, keep you warm. When you stand in the night, I will shelter, I will find. Oh, you're broken and shattered, more than no return. Pick up the pieces and you let the bridges burn. So come to the water, sailing with the breeze. Take a step into the river, where you will find peace. Where you go in the storm, I will hold you, keep you warm. When you stand in the night, I will shelter, I will fly. I will fly. The storm, I will hold you, keep you warm. When you stand in the night, I will shelter, I will fly. So come to the water, where you will find peace. Take a step into the river and get down on your knees.
Look at you, you make me blind. Why do you have to be so beautiful all the time? I know I can't be with you. It's killing me to see you with someone else. What to do? Now I'm in the corner, watching you smile, watching you smile. Oh.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If I could have your attention. Thank you for those of you who have come back after lunch. I know it was really tempting to stay away and continue eating those beautiful barbecue chops. So thank you for coming back. Welcome to this afternoon session, the second last session of day 3. We've certainly had some very interesting presentations this morning, and they will continue into the afternoon. Our first speaker today is Lewis Bribblecombe from the Pacific Labour Facility, and he will be speaking on reflections and insights from the Pacific Labour Facility 2018 to 2023. Thanks, Lewis.
Binaka, Carolyn. I'm Lewis Brimblecombe, as Carolyn said. I'm the Strategy and Partnerships Manager at the Pacific Labour Facility. That's the PLF. I'd like to thank USP and the Dev Policy Centre for hosting this event and giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about the honour that I and the PLF have had in supporting Australia Pacific labour mobility over the last 5 years. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the work that PLF has done to date, and then dive into 4 key reflections from our experience in delivering the program. These thoughts and more will be captured in the PLF Phase 1 completion report that will be developed later in the year. That's a no. So the PLF is an Australian government funded initiative, the contract for which was awarded to Palladium in 2018. The PLF was designed to establish and administer the Pacific Labour Scheme, which is now the long-term wing of the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility, or PALM scheme. The PLF was explicitly designed with a strong emphasis on driving development outcomes, including gender, disability and social inclusion. The PALM scheme allows eligible Australian approved employers who meet a range of criteria and undergo extensive assessment, access to a pool of reliable, productive workers from 9 Pacific Islands and Timor-Leste, when there is not enough labour available in rural and regional parts of Australia. The PLF contract is due to be completed in December 2023. And while it's only been 5 years since it started, PLF implementation has seen extraordinary levels of growth, evolution, change, and the need to respond to complex issues. I should be clear at the outset that PLF does not have responsibility for management of the domestic support to what was the seasonal worker program. That's retained by the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations. And I also want to be clear that the PLF does not have responsibility for any of the policy settings surrounding either the domestic or in-Pacific delivery of the scheme. But what we do is have responsibility for a series of functions that span the full worker and employer engagement with the scheme. So on the supply or sending country side, the Pacific Labour Facility provides support to sending countries' involvement in the scheme. This includes capacity building to labour sending units, which are the sort of heart of the in-Pacific support to labour mobility. This includes training of LSU staff, support with policy and strategy development. We provide direct funding of significant numbers of operational staff within labour sending units. We also support the development and ongoing support to the in-country recruitment database. We provide support to sending country reintegration efforts to help returning workers socially and economically when they come back to the Pacific and Timor-Leste at the end of their placements. We also provide support to worker prep, including collaboration with national training organisations, as well as the Australia Pacific Technical Coalition. In Australia, the PLF works with employers to build their capacity to understand and implement the scheme. We've developed a cultural competency framework to enable better understanding of cross-cultural sensitivities by all stakeholders. We provide oversight of employer recruitment, redeployment, and mobilisation processes. And in the last 18 months, PLF has established an Australian regional presence that provides on-the-ground localised support to employers and other stakeholders. The PLF also provides direct support to workers through case management of critical incidents, the delivery and coordination of thematic workshops and training on issues including drug and alcohol abuse, safe driving, and respectful relationships. Funding is also provided through the PLF for skills development in Australia on everything from first aid courses to forklift truck licenses. Underpinning all PLF work in Australia is its community of care approach. This seeks to engage all actors involved in supporting worker wellbeing in the communities that workers live in. The community of care includes approved employers, sending country governments representatives, including country liaison officers, community connections program, community groups such as Diaspora organisations, churches and sports clubs. PLF has also invested in strong monitoring, research and communications functions. These enable us to collect robust evidence and learning on the scheme that can be used to inform policy and program implementation and communicate program successes, as well as develop resources for building stakeholder understanding of the scheme. So I'm now going to talk about some of the lessons learned from our implementation. The first lesson is that unexpected growth is complex to manage. When the PLF commenced, we placed significant emphasis on stimulating demand from employers to participate in the Pacific Labour Scheme. This involved promotion and marketing activities, attendance at industry events, and extensive conversations with prospective employers about the value of participating in the scheme. While the seasonal worker program had progressively grown over a number of years, when the PLS was established, there was no guarantee that there would be demand from industry for either workers being employed over a 3-year time horizon or for workers outside of the horticulture and agriculture sector, as the SWP had been almost entirely focused on short-term agriculture and horticulture placements. Suffice to say, the sort of promotional activities previously delivered are not a core component of PLF's work today. As you can see from this graph, the COVID-19 period saw a huge and largely unexpected growth in worker numbers. When the scheme was restarted during COVID, across the seasonal worker program and the Pacific Labour Scheme, there was around 6,500 workers in Australia. There are now over 37,000, of which around 13,000 are on the long-term stream. This growth was driven by Australian border closures, the departure of backpackers and other migrants, and the preferential status given to PALM scheme workers, as well as the mass adoption by industry of the PALM scheme in a very short space of time. In response to this growth, PLF scaled up and adjusted its support model. In many ways, PLF had to shift from a direct or service delivery model to one where we acted as an intermediary for other actors in the labour mobility system. In short, supporting a couple of thousand PLS workers looks very different to supporting 13,000. In practice, this meant moving from a case management model where historically the PLF would support all individual PLS workers on a one-on-one basis through their mobilisation, to needing to work through approved employers, country liaison officers, and other community of care stakeholders. Except in the case of critical incidents where PLF remains responsible for the coordination of response, often directly engaging with workers. The rapid growth of the scheme is a testament to the value that AEs place on PALM workers and the commitment and efforts of all involved. But we must acknowledge that this growth stretched the capabilities of all parties involved in the scheme, including approved employers, sending country governments, their reps in Australia, communities, the PLF and the Australian government. The impacts of this incredibly rapid growth, both positive and negative, on workers, their family and the Pacific are complex and only now starting to become clearer, including through the PLMS, which we heard presented on earlier today. But I think we can all acknowledge that more can be done to support workers and their families through their entire journey. But we must also acknowledge that this was very difficult during the COVID period and in the context of this very large growth in worker numbers. All right, lesson 2. Labour market and industry analysis can only get you so far. I also thought about calling this slide, "Let the market decide," but see what you think. This photo here is of one of the Samoan PALM scheme long workers at a meatworks in Cowra in New South Wales. The phenomenal growth of meat processing, which has become the largest employer industry under the PALM scheme long, was not expected at the outset of the PLF. PLF has undertaken extensive labour market analysis and detailed industry assessments over the last 5 years. These were designed to better understand where growth and need for the scheme would likely come from, and was coupled with extensive dialogue with Pacific governments about the sectors they were interested in as part of their broader economic and human development strategies. In practice, the meatworks industry, independent of PLF analysis or promotion, identified the PALM scheme as the labour solution it needed. A small number of labour intermediaries or labour hire companies then facilitated huge growth in worker numbers in the sector. This has led to approximately 70% of all PALM scheme loan workers being employed in the meat and meat processing product manufacturing sector. This has implications on the opportunities for worker skills development through employment, as well as the gender dynamics of the scheme. With the Australian meat processing industry continuing to be predominantly male and its recruitment of PALM scheme workers reflecting this. On the flip side, many other industries, particularly those with higher skills requirements, where our labour market analysis identified large potential opportunities for growth, have taken more time to realise the value of the PALM scheme. They've required more tailored engagement from the PLF and the Australian government to address some of the key constraints. Residential care services or aged care was identified early on as being a strong fit for the scheme and aligned with many of the skills development interests of Pacific countries. The reality has been the industry's involvement in the scheme is only now starting to reach scale, with over 600 PALM scheme care workers now in Australia. This slower uptake has been in large part due to the industry's need for workers to have formal Australian qualifications, as well as tight margins restricting investment in new workers in what is a largely government-funded sector. It's probably worth noting that through the current aged care expansion project being managed by the PLF, we're expecting to double the existing cohort of PALM scheme aged care workers in Australia. Through the I.T.S program, the PLF is working with approved employers, labour sending units and training providers in the Pacific and Australia to fully fund training for aged care workers. Lesson 3, an evolving understanding of sustainability. Working towards the sustainability of Pacific labour mobility has been core to the PLF's thinking since day one. But over time, how we think about, conceptualise and manage for sustainability has changed. In its earliest days, PLF considered labour mobility sustainability primarily in terms of driving greater alignment between the financial costs of involvement in the scheme and the accruing of financial benefits to participants in the scheme. The idea being that greater balance between those two things would result in a more equitable outcome for participants, specifically workers, sending countries and approved employers. Our sustainability vision was that PLF could progressively learn from implementing worker, employer and sending country support, and then transition functions and responsibilities and costs to those stakeholders who are directly benefiting from the scheme, primarily approved employers and Pacific governments, as they would have the incentives and funding to continue the scheme. So that was our kind of thesis at the start. Since then, the benefits of the PALM scheme long to key stakeholders have been significant. Cumulative remittances and savings under the long-term stream of the PALM are, per latest PLF estimates, estimated to be over $170 million. While PALM scheme long-term workers are estimated to have contributed to over $560 million in employer profits. As highlighted on the previous slide, due to scaling of the program, full responsibility or greater responsibility for some key functions have now been assumed by approved employers for aspects of the Australian deliver of the PALM scheme long. Where the dynamic has been more complex is in the ongoing support PLF provides to Pacific labour sending units. The reality has been that as Australian demand has grown for the scheme, the amount of pressure being placed on labour sending units and other Pacific government agencies has grown beyond sending countries' abilities to organically scale. As I said, growth was phenomenal. While at the same time, taxes paid by workers in Australia are, per PLF estimates, estimated to have exceeded $100 million. This arguably means the question of alignment between who pays and who benefits is far less clear than we originally thought. So sustainability, as conceptualized by the PLF, has evolved to think more holistically about balancing the positive and negative impacts of the scheme beyond just financial aspects, and thinking how we mitigate the negative social and economic consequences of the scheme on all stakeholders. And we know the concerns of the scheme. We know about worker disengagement, family separation, violence, substance abuse, and exploitation. While many of the drivers of these issues are associated with events in the external environment, notably COVID, and as per the last presentation, on balance, the benefits still outweigh the costs, the issues are there, they are real. And for the program to retain its social license and support in both Australia and the Pacific, what matters to be truly sustainability is how these issues are effectively managed as the program continues to grow. Final lesson. Lesson 4, technology is an essential tool when supported by effective engagement and relationships. The creation of an end-to-end technology platform that enables worker data and reporting to flow from sending country governments to employers and back again has been a cornerstone of PLF's work. The idea for a management information system was in the original PLF design, but it was focused primarily on tracking basic program data. Over time, technology has become core to the way in which supply and demand interface on the program. The I.T.S and in-country recruitment database form the backbone of PLF and increasingly labour sending unit and soon approved employer business processes. They provide integrity, efficiency, and connectivity, but they also support scalability of the scheme. The in-country recruitment database enables worker self-registration, centralised management of worker data, as well as allowing sending countries to get updates on workers once they are mobilised. It is already implemented in 6 countries and will be rolled out to PNG and Kiribati over the next few months. There are 150,000 registered candidates in the current in-country recruitment database and over 400 users, including labour sending units, as well as agents under the Vanuatu model, covering not only the PALM scheme, but also other labour mobility programs, including the RSE scheme and the Korean scheme. Too often, tech platforms in the Pacific have failed. Our experience tells us that one reason for this is that insufficient time and energy is spent on communicating the principles underpinning the tech, the user benefits of the tech. And in the case of sensitive data, such as that of workers, the ownership of that data and the platform by countries in the Pacific and the privacy controls that are in place. Uptake and buy-in to PALM scheme and PLF technology platforms has only been possible due to the trust and partnerships that PLF has created with sending countries and other stakeholders. And that's important. It's important for outcomes, but it's also important because labour mobility is by its nature about people. It's about the individual workers who make the huge and often very difficult decision to come to Australia, but it's also about the individuals involved in every stage of the process, whether they be in the labour sending unit or within employers or country liaison officers on the ground in Australia. And the successful development and rollout of the IRD and now I.T.S is as much a reflection of effective relationships as it is of technology transfer. And on that note, I'm at the end of my presentation, and I guess I just want to sort of stop on that final point that while PLF has often operated at a system level in the way it develops its sort of supporting mechanisms, I want to reiterate that the biggest lesson for PLF has been that we need to constantly strive to better understand the needs, incentives, and cultural dimensions of our stakeholders as individuals. And ultimately for the PLF, our greatest asset in doing this has been the ability and diversity of our staff and their ability to form these effective relationships with key stakeholders. Thank you.
Thanks, Lewis, and thanks for keeping on time. And I think I might have forgotten to introduce myself earlier on. I was so focused on introducing our guests. My name is Carolyn Jalal. I'm the Labour Mobility Manager at APTC, the Australia Pacific Training Coalition. Our next speaker is Linda Kynan. Linda is from the University of the Sunshine Coast, and she's going to be speaking on, is Australia doing enough to ensure the safety and well-being of Pacific workers in Australia? Thank you, Lindy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to University of the South Pacific and Development Policy Centre for giving me the opportunity to be here with you today and present you some research that I've been working on over the past couple of years. I'd just like to start off by taking some advice from I.T.S yesterday, which was don't start with your content. We don't care about your content unless we have a connection. So just to tell you a bit about myself. I've had some family ties to Papua New Guinea for quite a long time. My great aunt was a Lutheran missionary. My first overseas trip was to Papua New Guinea when I was in primary school. And my grandfather on my father's father was stationed in Papua New Guinea during World War II. I've also volunteered in the Pacific, here in Fiji on Overlau Island at Rukuruku Primary School. I've spent 6 months living on Malakula in Vanuatu. I've been really interested in the Pacific and Pacific Islands over my career in international development. But on the Australian side, I've also worked in family violence policy with the Attorney General's Department and with various non-government organisations. So my topic for today is Australia doing enough to ensure the safety and well-being of Pacific workers in Australia. Risky title, I know. And I'm going to answer this question by telling you about a research project that I've worked on over the past couple of years with my colleague, Dr. Judy Punt, who's a senior research fellow at the ANU Department of Pacific Affairs. When I worked on this, I was a senior research officer with the Department of Pacific Affairs, and I still do some casual work with them. And I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of the Sunshine Coast, which I've just started. And the topic for my PhD research will be the PALM scheme and women's safety and violence against women in the PALM scheme. I also just wanted to mention that during my presentation, I mentioned domestic violence and sexual violence, and I just wanted to give you a heads up about that and just encourage you to seek support if there's anything happening in your life or with your loved ones, that there's services out there, the Fiji Women's Crisis Centre here in Suva, or wherever you are, just reach out and don't suffer in silence. So the objective of our study was to investigate safety and wellbeing experiences of men and women in the PALM scheme in Australia. We designed the study together with some colleagues at the Pacific Labour Facility, and we agreed on these locations for the study. It was Cairns and Caboolture in Queensland, Tamworth and Wagga Wagga in New South Wales, and Naracoorte in South Australia. And these locations coincided with a number of community forums that the PLF was running. So we were able to go along and piggyback on those forums. The data was collected last year between April and November. The methods that we use, we did an online survey of workers. The PLF helped us to distribute that to workers in Australia who they had mobile phone numbers on record for, and we got 300 responses to that. We did a stakeholder survey. We interviewed over 100 people, and then we observed a number of events that the PLF was coordinating, these regional accelerator forums, which were community forums in those locations. And then following on from those forums, some regional networks were created. So I was able to sort of follow the journey of the Southeast Queensland network where I live. And we also attended some online network meetings for South Australia. So this is who we spoke with. I'm not going to go through it in the interest of time, but just to mention that we spoke to 44 PALM scheme workers, and there was a mix of short and long-term workers who were disengaged, people who were team leaders, so workers who were designated as a team leader for their group, and it did span horticulture, meat processing, and the aged care sectors. And this is who responded to the survey. You'll see a large percentage was from the Pacific Labour Scheme. That's because we worked together with the PLF, and that's who we had the most phone numbers for. In terms of gender, quite in line with the program numbers, we're mostly male, and also in terms of state distribution, also in line with the program numbers, as Queensland and New South Wales have the highest number of workers. This will all be online, so I'm not going to go through everything in detail. And this is the snapshot of who responded to our stakeholder survey. So mostly when you add up the labour hire, direct employers, and the labour hire host site, quite a lot of employers, and then other people who were involved with the program in some way. So this slide really summarises what we found in terms of safety and wellbeing experiences and the things that, the factors that affected that. I was quite new to this whole scheme when I started, designing this research proposal at the beginning of 2021. I've learned so much in the last couple of years, and it just seemed to me like, every individual that comes, they have a different background, they have a different experience, they're going to different places in Australia, different sectors. So it's really hard to generalize. And I felt like there was sort of workers in the middle and things that were pulling them in either direction, where either they were well and looked after or where they were having issues. So things that were contributing to workers having this sense of well-being, wellness and safety were strong connections to family and community, when their life in Australia met their expectations, when they were able to access culturally appropriate services, when they had a supportive welfare officer. So each of them has a person within their employer who's the welfare officer who they can go to when they need something. Some employers have amazing people. Others, workers told us that this person was not helpful. When workers are able to practice their culture and spirituality, when they understand consent and Australian domestic violence laws, when they have knowledge about contraception and how to access that in Australia, and knowledge of sexually transmitted infections, and a good understanding of how to access healthcare. On the right side, things that were contributing to workers not having a good time in Australia, being unsafe, unwell, is when services are difficult to access, and that's because of transport. A lot of people are in very regional and remote locations, lack of knowledge about where to go, cost barriers, language barriers, and fear. And we have alcohol abuse, dangerous driving, misinformation, really difficult working conditions, particularly the cold of being in meatworks, the gruesome nature of working in meatworks, the hard labour, and the injury risk particularly came up. When people are isolated, when they're unclear about their deductions, and they're unclear about what the correct pay rate is, when they have inadequate preparation, when they're under financial stress, and when there's issues regarding accommodation. So what mechanisms are in place to support safety and wellbeing? Lewis talked about the community of care model. I just put this up to sort of demonstrate there's a lot, it's a very complex program when you're in Australia. There's a lot of different stakeholders. And I think this demonstrates, number one, my lack of graphic design skills, but just how many different, I guess, stakeholders are involved. And we've had the seasonal worker program, and then sort of mechanisms related to that, the Pacific Labour Mobility Offices, the Community Connections Program. On the other hand, we've had the Pacific Labour Scheme and this regional engagement model. And the time that we were going out and visiting employers, there was sort of seemed like these two parallel systems. The government had announced that the programs had been aligned, but that wasn't apparent on the ground yet. In our survey of workers, we asked them, who do you turn to for help if you have a problem regarding safety? And most of them said they would go to their employer, and which is what they're told to do. They're told to go to your employer in the first instance for any problem that you had. Next, team leader, then using the Palm support phone line, then friends and family in home country, then Pacific friends or family in Australia, Australian friends, and then church pastor was the order of ranking. We also asked, what barriers do workers face in terms of accessing support for safety and wellbeing issues? The surveys for the stakeholders and the workers was slightly different, but coming out of the stakeholders that we spoke to, who we saw earlier, includes a lot of employers. Their number one reason that they say workers don't seek support is because they're shy or they're embarrassed. And then we have language barriers, cultural barriers, lack of services, lack of culturally appropriate services, and a lack of information. For the worker survey, the number one reason that the workers gave about not seeking support is because they're worried about their job or their visa, which is problematic when we're telling them you have to go to your employer for any problem that you have. People don't want to speak to their employer about sensitive personal issues, is what we found. Also, they're shy or embarrassed to ask for help, not confident speaking English, not sure where to go, that services don't understand Pacific culture, and that it's hard to get transport. I just wanted to give you a snapshot of, one of the places I visited, which was Lakeland, which is in North Queensland, up in the Cook Shire. I would consider this a remote area. I didn't have mobile reception for the 2 days that I went there. It's a tiny town. It's got a pub, a roadhouse, a school, and then a workers' accommodation where there's 100 Pacific Island workers living together in cabins, caravans, and they go out each day to work on the banana farms and avocado farms around Lakeland. And it just really struck me how difficult it is to access services and how reliant on your employer you are. If you want to go to the doctor, if you want to go to Cooktown or Mareeba, you need to work with your employer, whatever the issue is that you're facing, which is problematic when we know that people are worried about their job and their visa. I want to talk briefly about some of the findings that we found relating to violence against women. Some of you would have seen this in Preeta's presentation on Tuesday. I've just put this up to highlight. So the big brown circles are the percentage of women who experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime for each of these countries. And the orange circles are women who disclosed physical or sexual violence in the past 12 months. So if we look at the countries participating in the PALM scheme, PNG, Timor, Solomons, Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, Tuvalu, Nauru, Samoa, we see we can extrapolate, or we can assume that a number of these women are coming to Australia and they've experienced this trauma in their lifetime. So, we need to be thinking about trauma-informed approaches. It also makes me ask the question, well, what percentage of the men that are coming are perpetrators of violence? In our survey, we asked about a range of social issues and asked people how big of a problem they thought it was. So on the question on how big of a problem do you think men hurting women is, Of the women workers who responded, 20% thought it was a very big problem, 11% a big problem. And if we look at the male numbers, less men thought it was a bigger problem. More men thought it was not a problem at all. I should mention that we're just finalising the report for this research, and that'll be out in the next couple of months on the ANU website, where you'll be able to get more information. And just moving on to those quotes. So people have said, domestic violence is not as visible as sexual assault, but it is happening. Someone else has said there's a lot of domestic violence cases that we've dealt with. Many of them go through to the police, but what complicates it is, compared to, Australian women, is that the woman, she might not have the networks, the freedoms to get away from the person that's perpetrating the violence. Others said, this was from a service provider, in the case of non-consensual sex, we have a really good sexual assault service and we explain the options, but to date, nobody has wanted to pursue it or to go to the police or another agency. There's definitely cases of sexual coercion. This is from a sexual health provider who's supporting women who've chosen to terminate a pregnancy. We don't feel like we're always able to get the full story. There's such a cultural reluctance to talk about anything related to sex. Even if a woman knows about domestic violence orders in Australia, there's probably a lot of fear going down that sort of process and what it might mean for her visa. And then in the worker survey, we sort of had a free text field at the end. Is there anything else you want to mention? And someone's put in, there's a lot of sexual harassment issues and cases that are not handled properly or looked into. So to summarize the types of violence that came through in the different interviews that we had, that we did, people spoke about intimate partner violence, where the couple had come together from the Pacific to Australia and whatever violence was going on in that relationship was continuing. We were told about controlling behaviours, where the woman was in Australia and the husband was back in the Pacific and controlling her every move. She was forbidden to do anything except go to work. And he had people in the community watching her and reporting back. So this woman was petrified. And then reports of sexual violence. This came through sexual health services, talking about sexual coercion. We were told about male palm scheme workers' interactions with sex workers that resulted in assault and charges. And we're told about sexual harassment in workers' accommodation, men getting drunk, knocking on the doors of women's accommodation. How's the time? So I just wanted to speak about the meat industry briefly. I know my presentation is jumping around a little bit. This is my colleague, Judy Punt, who's very passionate about the meat industry, and she's doing some further research in this area. So we just wanted to highlight, these are very difficult industries. They're very hyper male-dominated cultures. There's often rude and abusive language, a lot of swearing. And when the time that we were doing our research, the palm scheme workers were getting paid less than fellow workers. The role of labour hire companies was quite critical, and the local representatives or the people could either be good or bad. And then we found that workers were working long hours, didn't have time to mix in the local community, but where they could, were involved in fellowship, sport and drinking. And we're also told about the shorter weeks and the income that people were getting not covering their costs because of the seasonal nature of that. So some of the good practices that we saw was increases in pay to reflect skills that were comparable to other workers. When there was clear and regular statements about deductions, and then it was explained well by the employer. When there was good worker representation through the team leaders, when the meatworks management was directly involved. We saw some doing an outreach model where the welfare officers, would be going out to workers rather than just sitting in the office waiting for workers to come to them with any problems. And we saw a difference it made about the ratios of how many welfare officers were available to the number of workers. We saw some bad practices, employers threatening to send workers home when they raised issues, labour hire company staff sitting in their offices, the unrelenting nature of the work, not dealing with racism, sexism, bullying, and being forced to take annual leave during the low season. So to come back to my initial question, is Australia doing enough? Australia is doing a lot, and I was surprised by what I saw and what I found in this sort of 2 years of research, understanding all of these different players and stakeholders. Australia is doing more than what I thought, but it's not quite enough. It's still not enough. We can do more. And it's a great opportunity at the moment with the program alignment to take the best of the both programs. You know, we've got this community connections program in some areas that we went to, working well, amazing Pacifica staff making connections. Other areas that we went to, no sign of anybody. And then the PLF's regional engagement model, really making sure there's staff in the regions where employers can have face-to-face meetings. We found that really valuable. So it's an opportunity to take the best of both of these models. We can do more to prevent and respond to violence against women. Sharing of data was an issue. Everywhere we went, people were saying, well, how many workers in my local government area? Or, you know, people at the hospital were talking about they base their staffing and their language of their staff on census data, but temporary visa holders aren't captured in census data. So people were just really desperate to know who's in our catchment, what language do they speak, and where can we go? Is there somewhere we can go to get this information on a regular basis? That's my timeout. I'll do the last 2 points. It's an opportunity to leverage all these amazing services. We heard about Village Connect in Logan yesterday, and the migrant settlement services are in the regions doing really great work with migrants. What can we learn from them? And the new deed coming in next month has some great changes about grievances, about cultural competency. So it's an opportunity to really make sure that that's followed through and there's compliance of that. Here's the contact details of myself and Judy, and we'd love to hear from you if you have any questions. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Lindy. We'll save the questions for later. We have an apology from Leota, who was going to talk from the Australian Workers' Union perspective. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today. But Lindy's presentation is followed by an appropriate one on migrant diaspora connections and Pacific food worker wellbeing in Australia. This project is headed by Victoria Steed from Deakin University, Christy Petrov from Griffith University, and Makiko Nishitani from La Trobe University, who's not here, but Victoria and Christy will be presenting on their behalf. Thank you, Victoria.
Do we bring the PowerPoint up ourselves? Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay, we're ready to go. So as Carolyn mentioned, Victoria and I are going to be presenting on a new project on migrant diaspora connections and Pacific food worker wellbeing in Australia. And in many ways, this builds upon some of the themes that Lindy was discussing in her presentation just now, and also some of the themes that Inez and Deborah presented on yesterday in their presentation. So this is a new developing research collaboration, and it's aimed at tackling some of the persistent challenges around wellbeing that we've seen through our own research, relating both to palm workers and to Pacific Islander food workers more generally. So it's based on many years of combined experience amongst our team members and also our community partners. And the aim of the research is to focus on the role of the diaspora and the relationships that they're forming with Pacific food workers. And we see these relationships as being really critical to ensuring the well-being of Pacific food workers. So the aim of the research is to understand these relationships. And we think that to understand these relationships, we need to really think about using a much broader, much more holistic and culturally grounded approach to understanding well-being than what we often see in policy and practice at the moment. Now, I've used the term Pacific food workers a little bit. When we're talking about Pacific food workers, we're talking about people who are working in both the horticultural and the meat packing sectors. And while this includes palm workers, it also refers to Pacific Islanders working in the food industries more broadly. So this is people like New Zealand SCV visa holders, undocumented Pacific Islanders who might be working in these industries, Australian citizens and permanent residents. Because what we've seen is that while research into the PALM scheme often focuses on these workers as a really discrete group, they don't exist in a vacuum, and they're contributing to and interacting with the communities that they live in very complex and really important ways. So the team that we have working on this project is a mix of community collaborators and also academics, a very multidisciplinary team. So in the community partner team, we have Emma Boetti from the Pacific Islands Council of Queensland. She made a brief appearance here yesterday, but I don't think we have her in the audience today. The Pacific Islands Council of Queensland is sort of the umbrella organisation for all of the Pacifica community organisations in the state. And they are also part of the PLF's Community Connections group. Melissa Salaga is part of the Point of Difference studio based in Shepparton, and Dean Wickham of the Pacific Islander Network in Mildura. And all of these organisations have played a really integral role in supporting Pacific Islander food workers in their regions. And they've done so both officially and informally for many years. In terms of the research team, we've got Victoria Stead. She's an anthropologist, also works in Pacific Studies, and she's spent literally years working with and researching seasonal workers in the Shepparton region. Makiko Nishitani, she's also an anthropologist and has done a lot of research in the Mildura region, looking at Pacific Islanders with different visa statuses. We've got a Tongan team member, Ruth Faliolo, based in Queensland. She's an expert in Pacific Studies and also Pacifica wellbeing. Myself, I'm a human geographer. I've done a lot of work in Vanuatu and also on labour mobility. Tony La Montaña, who is a public health and workplace health expert, and Elsa Underhill, who is a workplace health and safety workplace relations expert. So what are the wellbeing challenges that we've seen in our own work? And Lindy has spoken about some of these in quite a lot of detail. So we do know that food workers in general can face widespread wage theft and exploitative and dangerous conditions. And this isn't something that is tied to a visa type, it's just a fact of what can happen in the industry. So the wellbeing impacts can include things like physical workplace injury, illness resulting from things like poor diet, poor living conditions. We've heard a little bit about accommodation issues for PALM scheme workers already today. Isolation and social disconnection, as Lindy just described for, I think it was Lakeland. Workers can find themselves living in really remote locations and be reliant on, for example, their employers to access services and so forth. Mental and emotional harm, and also in some instances, death can result from working in these industries. We've also seen over the last few years, particularly since the COVID-19 pandemic, and we had a great presentation on this morning from one of our keynote speakers, that Pacific Island sending countries are increasingly vocal about their concerns about worker wellbeing and believe that more attention needs to be given to this topic. Now, it is really hard to quantify accurately how the extent of these wellbeing challenges, but we do know that there are disincentives for workers to report these challenges. So we just saw in Lindy's presentation that about 56% of respondents in her survey said that they were scared of losing their jobs if things went wrong. There are also cultural norms around not wanting to rock the boat, not wanting to challenge authority that can also disincentivize complaining about things when they're not quite right. We saw during the COVID-19 pandemic that a lot of these vulnerabilities were really intensified, or at least became a lot more visible than they had been in the past. And it was really a bit of a tipping point to drawing attention to some of these things. So what's the role of the diaspora in all of this? We've seen in our own research that intra-Pacific relationships of support are happening in response to some of these structural vulnerabilities. So, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw within some of the communities that we were working in, the diaspora organisations, both formally and informally, were doing things like providing food deliveries, we're doing clothing drives and things like this to support workers caught up in lockdown or quarantine. And also when health and income support, things like JobKeeper, weren't made available to people because of their visa type. We've also seen diaspora and community organisations supporting palm workers and others during health challenges, things like pregnancy. And there have been concerns raised about how these new visa types that, like the Pacific Engagement Visa that are going to be starting up soon, how are issues around health going to be managed in these schemes or in these visa types as numbers grow? We've also seen in our past research examples of care and connection through things like information sharing, providing cultural and religious community for food workers. So, for example, in one of our end user groups is a Brisbane-based law firm, and they do a lot of work providing advice on migration pathways through free community workshops around Australia. Work by many of our team members has documented some of the social and cultural ties as well that bind Pacific Islander communities together across visa types and migration streams. So this includes things like organising shared labour contracts, and so forth. So I'm going to hand it over to Tori now, who's going to begin by speaking about some of the existing approaches to wellbeing.
Great, thank you, Kirsty. So that Lindy mentioned towards the tail end of her presentation, there is a lot going on in this space. There's a plethora of initiatives and mechanisms, and they're doing some things, and I think there are other things that are not being done. So what I want to speak a little bit about now are some of those existing approaches to palm workers' wellbeing, and then moving on to discuss some of the ways that we might learn from a rich body of work that's being done, often by Pacific Islander scholars themselves, on Pacific understandings of wellbeing, and to think about what we might draw from those insights. So existing approaches to the wellbeing of palm scheme workers have often tended to emphasise increased regulation and control over workers' conditions, including by the labour hire agencies who frequently are involved in the organisation of these workforces. So this includes, for example, requirements for employers to arrange accommodation, mandatory deductions from workers' pay to cover private health insurance. And look, there is a really important role for regulation. However, the regulatory constraints of the palm scheme can also produce more coercive and disempowered effects for workers, reducing their capacity to make decisions about their working conditions and personal lives. Regulated pastoral care provision for workers has often involved large nonprofit service providers that don't always have strong or local cultural connections to workers. And there has been positive movement in this space in recent years. So moves towards including regional Pacific Islander peak bodies in pastoral care provision, for example, is a really strong move. The establishment of the Community Connections program, another really strong move. And both of these, I think, reflect a growing awareness of the significance of the support networks that are forming between Pacific migrant and diaspora communities. However, there's also very little in the way of a solid evidence base to be evaluating these initiatives, and a lot of the anecdotal evidence that we're hearing that's really motivating our interest in pursuing this research further indicates that the efficacy remains quite constrained, partly by the powerful mediating role of labour hire agencies and structural constraints in the administration of the scheme. Further, Pacific Islander workers outside of the PALM scheme obviously are not included in these initiatives, and more broadly, the lack of cultural understanding has been identified many times as a pressing issue in relation to the industries. So what might we learn then from Pacific Islander insights into wellbeing? I think we've got a huge opportunity here to be drawing on this body of work. So Pacific Islander understandings of wellbeing are, as Tongan scholar and our collaborator Ruth Faliolo has demonstrated, holistic, culturally embedded, encompassing familial and spiritual considerations alongside material ones. And I do want to do a shout out here as well to Inez and Deborah from the Village Connect initiative, who yesterday really compellingly, entertainingly shared their incisive, very exciting work on Pacifica wellbeing that they're doing in Brisbane. And what they really drew out so effectively for us in that presentation were all the important ways in which Pacific Islander approaches to wellbeing can so often differ from Western-focused models. So in thinking about PALM, I think one of the important things that this growing body of work on Pacific wellbeing tells us is that migration and work are often really significant factors in Pacific people's pursuit of a good and happy life, but also that the motivations, the valuations and decision-making in relation to these things can differ quite markedly from assumed or Eurocentric norms. So in this way, we would suggest Pacific Islander wellbeing can be understood and is pursued in the context of rich and enduring patterns of transnational relationality, of Pacific world making, entailing connections to people and place across the Sea of Islands. We also need to recognise that both Pacific Islander wellbeing and world making are enacted in contexts that are marked by structural inequalities, including racism, socioeconomic exploitation, colonial histories, and the effects of differential migration statuses and other technologies of categorisation and control. So we need conceptual and analytical frameworks that can attune us to decision-making and agency across multiple scales. So individual, absolutely, but also familial, community, regional, national scales. And we need to be attuned to the historical patterns underlying contemporary labour mobility, including histories and hierarchies of colonialism, race and uneven development that shape the conditions of possibility within which Pacific people today are making choices about labour mobility. So doing this, we suggest, requires complex and multidimensional methodologies and also careful and sustained relationship building. So what are we embarking on? So as Kirsty mentioned, this collaboration is in its early stages, but it's drawing on work that many of us in the team have been doing for many years now, including in dialogue with our community partners. So we've got, I think, a really strong team, and really importantly, it's grounded in those connections with the community organisations that we work with. We're in the process of doing kind of initial conceptual and co-design work with stakeholder interviews, hopefully commencing this year. And then what we're hoping to do is to move into a much more sustained, longitudinal kind of deep dive on the ground. So we've got a case study approach for our work, and I'll explain in a minute why I think that's really important. So 3 sites that we're looking at: Logan in Brisbane, Mildura and Shepparton, both of which are in regional Victoria. So all of these are nationally significant food producing areas. They're all sites that have Pacific Islander communities that are actively involved in so-called low and semi-skilled labour in horticultural and meatpacking and processing industries. But there are also interesting differences between these sites that will facilitate comparative identification of specific cultural and social determinants of worker wellbeing and world making. So Brisbane has long been a site, of course, of Pacific Islander migration by virtue of its proximity to the Pacific region, and Queensland more broadly is also an important site of Australian South Sea Islander community. Logan, a peri-urban site, has a high rate of trans-Tasman migration with established Samoan, Tongan and Fijian communities involved in horticultural work as well as meatpacking and abattoir work. In contrast, both Shepparton and Mildura are regional areas, the former a site of apple and pear production in particular, with Mildura a site particularly of citrus. Mildura has a Pacific Islander community that is larger and longer established than that in Shepparton, predominantly of Tongan, Fijian, Cook Islander and Solomon Islander heritage. Shepparton has a resident Pacific Islander community that is predominantly Samoan and Tongan, but also has a greater concentration of Ni Vanuatu temporary migrant workers coming through the PALM scheme. And there are some really interesting connections that we're observing there between kind of different cohorts of Pacific Islander people as well. Mildura has a larger population of Pacific Islander workers with irregular status, which presents distinct challenges to accessing health and services. So a case study approach is going to allow us to really focus on building rich and deep mapping of the complex relationships between different groups of Pacific food workers and between food workers and the wider diaspora communities that are present in these places. Longitudinal work with partner organisations will document changes over time in the nature and intensity of those relations, including as developments like the Pacific Engagement Visa and potentially family accompaniment are rolled out over the next couple of years. In terms of methods, we're drawing on a range of methods. Talanoa, Ruth Falioli, who's also done some really interesting and innovative work in digital forms of Talanoa that we'll be using as well. And then ethnographic methods like participant observation, qualitative interviewing, and so on, supplemented with surveys to capture the breadth of the relationships that workers are drawing on to support their wellbeing. So through these methods, we aim to build rich understandings of how Pacific food workers and their communities understand and pursue wellbeing in the context of their own lives, the resources and the relationships they draw on, both formal and informal. And we want to understand more about and document the complex effects of migrant diaspora relationships, including the potential strains and costs that communities are bearing as they are increasingly, in many cases, called on to fill the gaps of institutional provision. So in terms then of, I guess, some of the practical implications around the work by way of wrapping up. So what we aim to do through the work is to ultimately craft new models of wellbeing for, by and of Pacific food workers, and to consider these in relation to the models of wellbeing that we see enacted in the dominant frameworks of policy and government in relation to PALM and food sector work more broadly. We're interested in identifying the gaps and divergences between these, as well as potentially the overlaps. And we hope that this will offer fruitful pathways for informing revised practice in industry and in policy. We're working towards producing concrete resources for wellbeing that can support these improved practices. But what we also really want to be doing with this project is documenting and providing forms of documentation that can also support the diverse organising and advocacy work that these community organisations are doing themselves. So to wrap up very, very quickly, a couple of concluding comments on the significance of food workers' wellbeing. So we've seen really big changes in Pacific labour mobility over the last couple of years, and I think we've got a lot of other big changes on the horizon. The Pacific Engagement Visa, family accompaniment, recently announced pathways to citizenship for NZ-SCV visa holders. These are all likely to increase the numbers and the diversity of Pacific Islander communities in Australia. I think these changes are also very likely to increase and intensify the interconnections between palm workers, other groups of Pacific Islander people involved in food sector work in Australia, and the diaspora communities in Australia. So I think we really do need to be looking beyond a limited framing of the palm scheme as if it were this kind of neatly bounded entity. I'd also suggest that we need to recognise that issues of wellbeing are about fundamentally the nature of the relationship between Australia and the Pacific, about how Australia is positioning Pacific countries and Pacific people in relation to itself now and into the future. And this is actually one of the most fundamental things that the Pacific Studies scholarship tells us, actually, is that questions about work, labour and migration must be embedded in broader considerations of relationality, of the flourishing of shared lives within families, within communities and within the region.
Thank you, Victoria and Kirsty. Great timing. Because we didn't have one speaker, we now have about 20 minutes for questions. So please put your hand up and I'll ask the panelists if they can sit on the chairs so they can address the questions. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the presenters. So my name is Natasha. I'm a PhD scholar at ANU doing research in labor mobility for Papua New Guinea. Thank you all for that presentation. It was very insightful. And I actually have a question for each of you. So for Lewis, I think it's really positive that we're talking about cultural competency training in Australia for the employers. I think that's something that we've been talking about in the Pacific for a while now. But what is and has been the role of the PLF in supporting Pacific Island countries who have struggled to significantly increase their participation numbers in PALM? A scheme that has been largely dominated by the biggest sending countries like Vanuatu, Tonga, and Fiji, and Timor-Leste as emerging players. The second question goes to Lindy. Thank you, Lindy. That was a really good presentation as well. Did you notice any differences in the responses based on country of origin, or were the results just kind of similar across all the countries? So for example, who did they contact first when they have a problem? Did you find that there was a difference disaggregated by the country of origin? I'm asking this because I'm specifically interested in, what kind of information you would have found for Papua New Guinea. To Kirsty and Victoria, I guess I'm curious, are many of these diaspora community partnerships engaging in informal or volunteer provision of well-being support services? And if this is the case, that means they would not have the same capacity of support as the other government service providers. And this also puts a lot of strain on the existing diaspora communities in Australia who are then expected to continue to provide this volunteer informal support. So they are not community liaison officers. They get the full support of, through the PLF. So if this is so, How are these informal support systems going to be recognized through a formal structure that encourages their access to capacity building support services, simple things like remuneration of staff or technology, including access to the IRD, if that is, if they are a possible user? I don't know, maybe Lewis, you can talk to that, I'm not too sure. But yeah, I guess those are like my 3 questions posed to the 3 of you. But yeah, no, thank you. Thank you, Tomas, for your presentations.
Thanks very much, Natasha. Maybe I'll touch on that first one. I think one of the great achievements of the PLF and the Pacific Labour Scheme was that in the first kind of 2 years of functioning, we were able to get mobilisations from every country under the PLS. But you are right in saying that some countries do have larger cohorts than others. I mean, PNG, I was just sneakily looking at the data, and we're about to go over our 1,000th PLS worker from PNG, which is a great achievement for Papua New Guinea and for everyone involved in the scheme there. But we do provide different support mechanisms in each of the countries. We have sort of engagement managers based in most of the 9 Pacific countries and Timor-Leste. We then do provide sort of funding for operational staff in each of the labour sending units, as well as support with monitoring evaluation, gender and social inclusion. And that's done on a sort of annual rolling basis, where we will sit down with the directors of the labour sending units and senior government officials to kind of understand what are the priorities of that team and how the PLF can kind of support rolling out those priorities over the year. So it's an ongoing process, but I am pleased to say that we have been able to support all of the sending countries in the Pacific to mobilise workers, but there's always room for growth. Thanks.
Thanks for your questions, Tash. Regarding for the interviews that we did, I mean, it was a really small number of workers that we interviewed, only the 44. Our study had a lot of limitations because, you know, we had limited resources. It was only Judy and myself. We didn't have translators. So, you know, it was quite biased in terms of who we spoke to because we're only speaking with those who had a high level of English. So well, to do it again, it'd be quite different. But this is where we are. So, I mean, from the interviews, one thing that stands out from a Papua New Guinean that I spoke to was, you know, a woman that was on the seasonal worker program who had so-called absconded and applied for a protection visa. And she had genuine concerns for her life because of violence going on back home. And she's currently waiting for the outcome of that visa. The survey, I'd have to get back to you about if we even collected data on the country of origin. We were just really conscious that nobody wants to fill out a survey, and how many of us have gone to do a survey and went, oh, this is too long, close the window, I'm not going to do it. So we just wanted to keep it super short. So I'll have to get back to you if we have data by country for the survey.
Yeah, look, thanks for those questions. So I guess we're interested in both formal and informal mechanisms of support, and certainly in the places where we're working, we're seeing both. So there is support being provided, for example, like organisations like Community Partners, PICQ, Point of Difference is a kind of a service provider in Shepparton. There is also, though, an enormous amount of work that's being done that is informal. So that's everything, you know, Kirsty mentioned some of the things that are happening, organising of food drives, clothing drives, work that is also being done within families, because what we're also seeing as well is that families themselves are increasingly inclusive of people with diverse migration statuses. And so those kind of complex familial and community ties are being mobilised to support workers' wellbeing. But does that cause strain and tension and burden? Yes, absolutely, it does. The absolute last thing that we want to be suggesting is that we need to uncritically look at this as an answer. And we certainly don't want to be suggesting that this somehow lets institutions or the state or employers off the hook in some way. This should not be seen as a replacement for proper, adequate support services at an institutional level. But we're interested in looking at this as a really important part of the picture of understanding actually what the conditions of life are like for workers when they're in Australia. And indeed, part of the impetus around the research is actually to provide a documentation, forms of documentation that can start to gesture to and evidence the enormous amount of work that is being done by diaspora communities in supporting workers. Because what we're hearing over and over again from the people that we're talking to is that work is not valued, it is not being measured. And so we want to also be providing documentation that can support those organisations and those informal communities in advocating themselves for resources, for funding, for support that they need, and that can start to evidence the impacts in all of their complexity that those relationships are having on diaspora communities.
Thanks, panel. Are there any other questions?
Hi, Pony Ravula from Suva. I've known quite a lot of members, some of them from nearby villages in Fiji who are participants. That's the connection in the labor mobility scheme. Thank you very much for your presentations. Particularly talks about some of the issues and challenges that participants are facing under the scheme. Earlier on, before lunch, the sessions was on increased salaries. We're coming from a low wage country, obviously. It didn't actually, remuneration comes in many forms. The salaries, other terms and conditions, whether they have counseling services. I understand, if you work in Australia, you'll have access to EPAs, for example, counsellors. And of course, one of the panelists mentioned the distances, the location of some farms. And the first and a natural stop for the employers is actually being put down, talk to the employers first. One of the things I was going to ask, and the gentleman, the first presenter, I've forgotten the name of the organization, but I know you intricately. It's actually whether in the preparedness of participants, whether they actually, there are a sort of, awareness on trade unions. I would like one day that participants out there in the fields, whether it's in Mildura, Sapperton, or anywhere, to be treated equally as their counterparts who are members of union, perhaps the Australian Workers' Union. Same, we couldn't get our colleague across to talk about those issues. A lot of the issues that you good panelists are talking about fall naturally into the realm of work that trade unions do. So packaging in terms of preparedness, perhaps the bodies concerned could look into as part of that an orientation that you can have access to telephone calls, and actually using institutions like the Fair Work Commission, any dispute resolution, EPAs, if you have any issues in there. And we've heard a lot about the difficulties that our people face, partly in a different country, those sort of things. One of the things I did also in our earlier presentation this morning, the mention of our learned gentleman from Samoa talked about blueberry farms, coming back, the transfer of skills. I wonder whether we're coming onto a stage where we could say a little bit more, Pacific Islander participants, the countries, in terms of actually matching the skills that will come back home and actually develop our people. Aquaculture, aqua farming, we are island communities, and actually linking up with that rather than coming back and totally redundant, waiting for our next move to Sapperton or to Griffith or to anywhere. An employee, if you are also an employer, to be involved as an employer under this scheme, perhaps looking into an employer checklist in terms, they should tick all those things, particularly in providing support for our people who are from the Pacific who are involved in the scheme now and into the future. One of the things, just to conclude in that, one of the things keeps coming in my mind are some studies, socio-historical studies done in the early 19th century in Fiji, when we used to have European plantation settlers. An observation, some of the observations were done at that time. You go into the province of Ra, where I come from, and it is devoid of able-bodied Fijians, taking a lot of our people. Earlier on, the ANU mentioned, there are different movements of people. These are supposed to be targeted to low-skill workers. The losing of brain drain perhaps refer only to, coup victims who moved on, or professionals. It's the emptying. Sometimes I can't help feel the emptying of skills, and when people are coming back, we may have improved in wages and direct salaries, but perhaps maybe lagging behind in other forms of remuneration or the well-being that each one of us as a worker seeks in life. Sorry, long way.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we want to give Lewis time to respond and answer if you have state Vinaka. Thanks, Lewis.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Was it Pone? Thank you, Pone. So a few questions. I'll try and respond to them. I guess the first thing to say on pre-departure briefings and the information in them. So each Labour sending unit or sending country government does their pre-departure briefings in a slightly different way. They're responsible for the delivery of them while we provide sort of support to the core material within them. And depending on the country, they will invite different organisations along to help deliver them. So that may be community organisations, that may be banks to help with financial planning. So you will see a range of organisations involved in them. And equally, the sort of partner information sharing on the Australian arrival side, which is called the on-arrival briefing process. Employers are certainly encouraged to invite representatives from unions and the Fair Work Ombudsman as part of that kind of on-arrival briefing that workers receive when they get to Australia, but that is led by employers. Just on skills matching, absolutely hear you in relation to aquaculture, and certainly there have been kind of explorations on the Australian end about potential opportunities for palm scheme workers in those sectors. I guess I come back to the slide I presented around meatworks, that the reality of the scheme is that a lot of it is driven by what Australian industry is seeking. We are relatively early on. It's 5 years since the PLS started, and the growth to date has been in meatworks and agriculture, and to an extent the care sectors and tourism. They're the kind of that covers the bulk. But I guess we'll see what the future holds, and certainly you do see additional skills opportunities there. Just a final one around employers and tick lists. So there's the deed, which is what employers have to sign up to with the Commonwealth of Australia. It sort of outlines their kind of legal obligations. But then there are guidelines that accompany that, and they do cover a much kind of broader set of practice for how employers should be kind of engaging with their workers at each stage of the sort of worker life cycle, and the supports they can and should provide to them. And then finally, just around flow or the Fair Work Ombudsman. So as part of PLF activities, we do undertake compliance activities on employers. So if a report is received by the Pacific Labour Facility, we do conduct investigations into that. And one of the functions at the end of those investigations is referrals on to the Fair Work Ombudsman, which, as you rightly suggest, is the sort of regulatory agency in Australia responsible dealing with any sort of formal worker exploitation or employer misconduct. I hope I caught everything. Thank you.
Thanks, Lewis. And unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time, but we have afternoon tea from 2:30 to 2:45. So please find the panel members in the afternoon tea break to ask your questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you have it, and the one that it's
Yeah, sure.
I have my WhatsApp if you want.
Oh, you have WhatsApp. I have WhatsApp. Okay. You just save your contact.
Kita, yeah, dia Indonesian number.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll send it through. Both pictures, the one you took, the one.
Yeah, thank you.
So, thank you. One from Diaspora.
I'm thinking about doing a PhD, and at the time I just I mean, I was waiting for 4 years after my master's. I didn't plan on doing a PhD. Yeah, there's like, yeah. Or you can definitely how each is.
Okay, so let's take presentation. You
Coming after this.
Yeah, like considering a PhD, there's a thing
Oh. Probably.
yeah, I'm trying to find him, but he's very connected.
Yeah. Just give me. Which one? 10. Which one is it? This one? Open? No, no, no again.
Your daughter is still here. She's gone back to. She's working now. Awesome. Could you have lunch now? Okay, Father. Good night.
1, 2. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the afternoon session of the Pacific Update Labour Mobility Day. This is our second last session, and we're finishing off with 2 panels. So we're just trying to pack in as much as we can in the little time we have left. And so we're going to, I know people are still coming back from their afternoon tea, but we're going to make a start. My name's Stephen Howes, and I'm from the ANU in the Development Policy Centre. I've been coming to these updates for a long time. And as was mentioned, I think we started the 3rd day on just on labour mobility and migration in 2019. And it's just been great to see today so how far the research has come and how many people are here from how many different walks of life and different perspectives. So congratulations, everyone. I also want to mention, if you haven't picked it up, do pick up your copy of our blog posts on Pacific migration. We produce this every year from our Dev Policy blog. So there's a lot of good material here on labour mobility and migration. And also want to encourage people to contribute to the blog, especially if you just made a presentation. It's a good way to get it out there. So just email us at the ANU. You'll find that on the website. All right, so we only got a short session today. That's another reason to get started. But this is a really interesting session. We're kind of going to change tack, and we're going to start talking about this new visa, Australia's Pacific Engagement Visa. And the topic is, can it be strengthened to meet the Blue Pacific needs? And we have a great panel of PhD students from the ANU. Here they are, all from the Pacific, who are going to be sharing their ideas about this. So I'm going to hand over to them. But I'm just going to briefly give a little bit of context, just because, we do have to reorient our thinking. We've been talking today entirely about temporary labour mobility, and now we're going to switch tack and talk about permanent migration. So the Pacific Engagement Visa is a totally new initiative for Australia. Some have called it revolutionary. It's not that revolutionary in that it's very similar to the New Zealand schemes, the Samoa Quota and Pacific Access category, but it is, from an Australian point of view, it is somewhat revolutionary. It's completely different to the PALM scheme. The only things in common really is that both schemes involve people moving for work, and both involve the Pacific and Timor-Leste. But otherwise they're very different. I know the panel will give you some context, but just to set the scene on how different they are, the PALM scheme is temporary, the PEV is permanent. The PALM scheme is uncapped, the PEV scheme is capped, and the current cap is 3,000. For the PALM scheme, you're selected by an employer. You have to find an employer who wants to get you to work in Australia. For the PEV scheme, you'll be selected via a lottery. right? You'll apply to a lottery, and if you're lucky, your name will come out. In the PALM scheme, you're tied to a job, right? In the PEV scheme, you have to find a job. Once you're selecting a lottery, you've got to find a job. But once you come to Australia, you're free to quit and find another job. The PALM scheme has lots of sectoral and geographical restrictions. The PEV scheme has none. The PALM scheme has really no access to benefits, whereas the PEV scheme has very good access to benefits from day one, including Medicare, but not just Medicare, things like childcare subsidy, even Oz Study. The only thing it doesn't have is the job starter scheme. And then the biggest difference, or not the biggest difference, but another difference, the one we're going to focus on today, is how those places are allocated. And PALM scheme has no country quotas. The PEV scheme does have country quotas. And, you know, the real advantage of that, one of the problems we've run into with PALM is that we've ended up taking workers that already have a lot of migration, you know, Samoa, Tonga, Fiji. You know, Vanuatu's a good case of a country that's done well in PALM that didn't have a lot of opportunities before, but the other countries that haven't had that many opportunities before haven't done that well in PALM either, like Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea. So these schemes, the PEV will allow you to target. And what we're going to talk about today is how Australia should target. So that's just a bit of context. And then the final thing I want to say is what is happening with this PEV. And actually, this is a very timely session. Labor committed to this PEV during the election campaign last year. And they said they would introduce it by July, which is next month. But they've made a lot of progress, and you can find details now up on the website. But one of the interesting things, you know, normally immigration in Australia doesn't go before Parliament. It's a matter really for executive discretion and regulation. But because this idea, so for example, for the PALM scheme, it's hardly ever, the only thing that's gone to Parliament as far as I know for PALM is the income tax implications. But for this, because this lottery scheme is so unusual, it's got to be legislated for. And so the Australian government has taken the PEV legislation to Parliament, and actually it's become controversial. So that's also interesting. So everyone says they support the PEV, you know, that's very positive. But basically, whereas Labor want to push the lottery, the coalition government has said they want to link it to PALM, so that actually the PEV becomes a pathway to permanency for PALM workers. Now, I think that's a bad idea, but it's become their approach. And so it has divided on party lines. It got through the lower house, where Labor has a majority. It's been to Senate. It's gone to the Senate. Senate committees considered it. Senate committee split on party lines. And it's now going to the Senate for a vote. In fact, it was going to go today. I think it's going to go, it may go tomorrow. Senate sitting next week. But, you know, it's as we speak. So it is very timely. But I do want to emphasize that legislation is only really about setting up a lottery. That's the only thing in the legislation. All those other issues, like benefits and how to set the quotas, how many for the total, that's all for the government to decide. And so this is a very, you know, a very useful discussion that we're going to have today. So with that introduction, I will hand over to our team, and I'll just briefly introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. We have Natasha Turiamoko. Natasha's from Divine Word University, Papua New Guinea. Her PhD is on labour mobility. Aka Rimon, her PhD, she's a former foreign secretary. Kiribati, her PhD is also on labour mobility. She'll be the second speaker. Third speaker is Jope Tarai, formerly from here, right? And his PhD is on digital economy, but it's great, you know, that you've contributed to this. And final speaker, Michael Kabuni. Michael's a lecturer in politics from UPNG, also doing his, in fact, you heard Michael, you would have heard him before, perhaps, talking about money laundering and anti-corruption, but also with an interest in labour mobility. So it's great that this, you know, PhD researchers come together to put this to you. So the order of speaking is Natasha, Aka, Jope, and then Michael's going to answer all the questions. Please welcome our first speaker, Natasha Turiamoko.
Thank you, Stephen, for that warm introduction. Kamna Mauri, Bulavinaka, Gutavin Intru, Kea, Mefuto. We're very privileged and honored to be here today as a collective to share with you some of our thoughts around labor mobility and the PEV specifically. We've really enjoyed the discussions that have happened over the few days, especially also this morning. I think, talking about the reforms in labor mobility, the partnerships and the policies that need to now be country driven. I think these are timely in ensuring the sustainability and strengthening the ties that we see in the region with Australia and their neighbors. This afternoon, we will present a conceptual framework, which we call the Pacific Mobility Index. This is a framework that we believe is Blue Pacific centric in providing additional guidance in the delivery of the Pacific Engagement Visa that recognizes the sensitive and competing priorities within the region and aims to continue to promote regional cooperation and agreement. We continue to hear about cooperation, regional cooperation, harmony. And so this is really where we draw our inspiration in developing this concept that we call the Pacific Mobility Index. Myself, Aka, and Joppe will speak a little bit about each of the slides. And our colleague Michael, who spoke yesterday on anti-money laundering, will join us in the Q&A session. I would like to also make mention that the views expressed in this presentation are that only of our own. We do not represent the views of the countries from which we come from, but that we are only really simply concerned Blue Pacific citizens who really have something to say about how we think the PEV should be shaped in response to the needs of the Pacific. I think we're also very open to welcoming your feedback and comments into this conceptual framework that we are developing. And we're very happy to receive any financial support to further develop this index as well. I just put it out there. This presentation will cover two main sections, beginning with a brief background of the PEV. I know Stephen has mentioned some of that already, which is good. I don't have to talk about all of it. And some of the thinking that has already gone into strategic selection before leading into the rationale for a Pacific Mobility Index. All right, so what is the Pacific Engagement Visa? Whilst those of you who follow Australian domestic politics may be familiar with this term, there's probably a lot of confusion within the region as to what is the PEV. There's confusion about what is the PALM scheme, and with the merger from long-term to short-term, there is a lot of confusion. And so what is it? When did we first hear about it? And Stephen has mentioned it was part of the Labour Party commitments in forming government last year. I think it's important for us to note that this is the first for Australia in any of its migration policies to announce a new visa that targets increased access, specifically to permanent migration for citizens of the Blue Pacific and Timor-Leste. And in the interest of advancing and strengthening Australia's ties, relationships, and people-to-people connections in the Pacific, wider collective consultation in the region should foreground the successful delivery of the PEV. And we heard from from I.T.S yesterday about the PRED and the need to engage with our peak regional body I.T.S as pivotal in ensuring that this continued cooperation sustains over time. Our PMI provides a 2050 Blue Pacific strategy inspired approach that will contribute towards achieving regional harmony and prosperity, even in a highly geopolitical landscape. We recognize that climate change is the single greatest threat in the region, and that Australia has also acknowledged this truth in its efforts to strengthen their own ties within the Pacific. I specifically put this quote and these pictures up here because I think it's also important for us to hold those who come up with these policies accountable to their commitments. So if you're talking about climate change, if you're talking about listening more and strengthening the Pacific family, these are important commitments that you've said publicly that we've all heard that we would now like to see some action towards. So I think Stephen has kind of mentioned a little bit about what the PEV is and where we are now. Basically, it's a 3,000 lottery visa system. If it rolls out as its proposed design, 12 eligible Pacific Island countries and Timor-Leste, whose citizens have access to the internet or have family members who are tech savvy, they will be eligible to make an online application for the PEV. These eligible citizens will then have the opportunity to enter a ballot at a nominal non-refundable fee of $25, and they'll be randomly selected. And the lucky ones, your names will get picked out and you'll be invited to apply for the visas. The visa will be delivered through a country pro rata, and we'll go into this in the next slide. And it's a proven and tested system, that New Zealand's specific access category has successfully delivered exclusively to citizens of Kiribati, Tuvalu, Tonga, and Fiji. So the PEV is built on the PAC. Apart from the eligibility criteria of the PEV, which is your age, medical, and citizenship, the visa will also be awarded once the applicant has completed the final step of the process, which is to secure a job. So like Stephen mentioned, Palm, you already have a job, PEV, you have to actually find. So even if we apply for a PEV, it's conditional upon your ability to confirm or secure a job offer. So whilst many of us may be eligible and put in an application, if you aren't able to complete the final step, which is, get that piece of paper that says, oh, you're a successful applicant to this job, that creates a lot of anxiety again for the applicants. So Stephen has already mentioned that there was a Parliamentary Senate inquiry. This group, as a collective, put in a submission ourselves proposing a PMI. And we should know by the end of this month from the deliberations of that. But we are looking forward to how this is going to roll out in the not too distant future. So under the current proposed design of the PEV, the ballot system country pro rata, I'm not too sure if you can really read that screen clearly, but basically what it means is that the countries with the biggest population, we will get most of the shares of the PEV. So Papua New Guinea, where I come from, with a population of almost 8 million people, we will get the largest share, supposedly. Now, because as I said, it's conditional upon whether or not we're able to secure a job offer. Now, is this fair, I guess, to our smaller sister island states like Kiribati, Tuvalu, Nauru, especially when these smaller atoll islands are at greater risk of existential threat from climate change? Would there be other considerations that we need to account for when determining visa allocation? Would the PEV create tension, division, and rivalry within the region? Unintended consequences. On what grounds should one country, even though I'm from Papua New Guinea, get more than another if based purely on country pro rata? I think these are serious questions that we as a collective, despite coming from different spectrums within the region, have been able to reflect that we have cooperation really as the key guiding principle that forges this relationship and partnership that we have. Now, there's been some work and suggestions to this design, which Stephen has written about, in the need for strategic selection of the visas based on 3 categories. So you have high access, those countries who already have relatively good access to Australia, Fiji, Samoa, Tonga. Those that have low access, this is by Diaspora. So you've got Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Timor, and then you have the climate affected atoll countries, so our sister island states. I think in a way, this is good because it recognizes climate change. There is a reallocation of visas with a minimum bound of 50, because if you're going to use the country pro rata without the minimum bound, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Nauru will be getting less than 5 or 10 people, 10 spots in PEV. So is there another approach? that we can look at to inform the PEV that reflects regional cooperation, harmony, and prosperity. These are the questions that drive and fuel our passion in investing our time and energy in this PEV, sometimes also compromising our own family time. And I think on that note, I will hand it over to Aka, who will really introduce the Pacific Mobility Index and what it means for us as citizens of the Blue Pacific in informing the PEV.
Okay, thank you very much, Power Mary Sister Tash, and a very good afternoon to everyone. It's so nice to be back in USB. So my part of the presentation, as Tash has introduced, is to flesh out the Pacific Mobility Index. Now, to do that, I want to begin by asking the question, why the need to strategically guide the Pacific Engagement Visa? And I think some of the elements that were raised in Tash's presentation just now address that, but I will attempt to address those more adequately. So as Blue Pacific citizens and scholars, this work is inspired by the recognition that the world we live in is becoming an increasingly challenging, but also geostrategic climate. We recognize also that our Blue Pacific home is becoming an increasingly, sorry about that, an increasingly contested space. And I think a space that often does not or neglects to consult our views. As a permanent migration pathway, the PEV is designed for our Pacific people. And for this reason, we feel that our leaders and our people should be given a say in it. We should be consulted so that the PEV can bring win-win benefits not just for Australia, but also to the Pacific Island region. Now, going back to the Pacific Mobility Index that I promised to unpack for everyone here today, why is it so important to us? And I think you can see on the side the 2050 strategy for Blue Pacific continent. As Blue Pacific citizens, we want this to align as much as possible to what we've been discussing here at the meeting since day one. We opened with that introduction about how to approach our challenges and opportunities as a region. So when this was first announced, we got excited, but then thought, hang on, this is going to create a lot of competition among the Pacific Island countries. How do we organize the selection process? How do we become a part of the selection system so that we have some say, we have some leverage, and not just wait for the decision to be made for us? So the first thing that stood out for us is that this will create a lot of tension among Pacific Island leaders. And my colleague Tash alluded to that by saying that some of us in the Pacific already have very good access to Australia. And then there are other smaller island countries, such as Kiribati and Tuvalu, Nauru, who don't have the privilege of that access. So the first reason we build the Pacific Mobility Index is to sort of avoid that regional competition. And if anything, want to promote us to work together as a region, for our leaders to agree and say, okay, so this is how we should design the selection. It is built on the UN Human Development Index framework. So it's a ranking system based on the priorities of each Pacific family member. And how it's going to work is we look at 3 dimensions. And the dimensions are climate vulnerability, and we're going to look at mean elevation. Now, we're not going to show you how this will work, because as Tash said, this is a conceptual framing of what we are building for the future. So we're hoping to have this fully fledged at some point. But climate vulnerability based on mean elevation. And the second dimension looks at access. So We spoke earlier about Diaspora. This is the number of Pacific Island population in Australia relative to the country population. And then the third dimension looks at economic well-being or GDP per capita. So what this means is the more economically resilient you are, means you are privileged or have established connections to Australia and do not really need this pathway as much as those countries with lower GDP per capita. So the PMI is not suggesting an alternative visa like the Pacific Skills Visa. It is simply offering a Pacific-centric approach to guide the fair allocation of visas, and as said earlier, to achieve its maximum output for each member of the Pacific family. It aspires to establish a fair determination of visa allocations that respects and recognizes the priorities of each of our Pacific family members. And Pacific family, in the language and the narrative of the Australian government, we believe is about consultation and speaking to the Pacific on how they feel the PEV should be designed or rolled out. So for the Pacific, what this means is very much what the 2050 strategy is about. We want our people, we want our children and our children's children to lead free, healthy and productive lives. And for this reason, we believe that the PEV should be considered as a systematic framework, such as the PMI, to inform the visa determination approaches. How the PMI will work is we want to operate similarly to the HDIs of the UN, as said earlier. But let me just speak more to the first dimension again, the climate vulnerability, which recognizes, as we've heard time and time again, the single greatest threat to the region and climate change. And I think it's important for me to also declare my positionality. If there's anything that I've learned from research is to, declare why you're doing this. And for me, coming from a small island nation means there may not be a pathway for us, no higher ground, and what can be done to sort of provide some protection mechanism. We heard at the keynote address this morning by Michael Clemens that very concern about the international system and law that does not have any protection mechanism for climate migrants. So that's the climate vulnerability dimension to assess geographical features of Pacific Island countries, and including elevation, total landmass, and coastal population. In the interest of time, I'll go into the second dimension again, Diaspora, which is cognizant of the Pacific's extremely low Diaspora numbers in Australia, as alluded to already by Natasha. The third is the economic well-being, as I have said earlier, measuring economic status of the PIC. And the ideal indicator would have been unemployment, but we appreciate that there is lacking data for this indicator, and so we use the GDP per capita as a proxy. I will end here and pass on to my colleague, Chopia.
Sorry, I've just been informed we have a very short amount of time, and because we started with only 30 minutes, I'm just going to defer to Q&A with Professor, if that's okay. No, I mean, Evie just said that I only have 15 minutes. I mean, 10 minutes, including Q&A. I would, yeah, oh, okay. So my contribution is because of my interest in and research in regionalism. What I am here to just re-emphasize is that the Pacific Mobility Index is born out of, first and foremost, two of the brightest minds the Pacific has ever had and will have for the future, which is our female Pacific scholars of the Blue Pacific. Interestingly, it was born out of drinking grog. Yes, believe it or not. So you can't get more Pacific than that. But also because this diagram is so central to it, because it re-emphasizes some of the key things that we've noticed being in the cold, very cold heart of Canberra, that majority of the policies that's designed about us doesn't include us. And so we felt it appropriate to bring it to, by submitting a submission to the Australian government, but also to share with the Pacific that these are what your Pacific sons and daughters are thinking about, and trying to push that recognition and distribution does not create competition, but creates cooperation amongst us. And effectively, my contribution is supposed to pinpoint directly to the 2050 strategy. And the main reason behind this is also we've noticed as Pacific scholars, and again, sons and daughters of the Blue Pacific, in Australia, we are often asked about every other strategy. Indo-Pacific strategy, God knows how many different strategies, nobody talks about the 2050 strategy. And it is our clear intention to re-emphasize to Australia and wider development partners that there is a need to connect with our 2050 strategy, as mentioned before by Pacific Island Forum representatives and various other development stakeholders, that it connects with, number one, the main theme, which is regionalism, and the PMI to us situates the notions around regionalism because it emphasizes in a very pragmatic way the core dimensions of what links with our interests, and of course climate change and climate mobility, which I don't have time to go into, but we'll be open to talk about in the Q&A.
Yeah, if you can, thank you to all our speakers. And sorry, we are a little bit short of time, but we still got 10 minutes. So I think we've got time for a good Q&A. So please come up the front, and who'd like to ask a question? I mean, this is the start of a conversation. We'll be hearing a lot more about the PEV and I'm sure the PMI, but who'd like to ask a question on where we're up to so far? Yes, Ryan's the first person I saw, and then there's someone else. Yeah, so we've got two people. Let's get going. Oh, let's start. Okay, you got the microphone, so you go first. Yeah. Okay,
Thank you.
Keep it short. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. My sincere appreciation to the presenters. Listening from the last session and the current session, one question. How does all this talk about Pacific mobility contribute to the realization that one day we will have a visa-free Pacific? Vinaka.
Yep, and there's also a question in the front. Did you want to ask?
That is a really good question.
Yep, down here.
And we actually attended the Lowy event in Canberra where Prime Minister Fiambe for Samoa was there at her launching, and she mentioned, the free trade movement similar to the European Union with the Schengen visa. And I think, we sat there and we thought, yes, wow, over time, well overdue, right? But it's taken Australia over 10 decades just to get to a PEV. So I believe it will probably take even longer to get to free movement within the region. But, I think we can remain optimistic if we continue to promote these Blue Pacific values that have enshrined the solidification of this region, the largest Blue Pacific continent. And we will continue to advocate for it because we know that, as individuals, even though Papua New Guinea may be bigger than Kiribati, we know that collectively together, we can work together to push these agendas and, advocate for free movement. But yeah,
Excellent.
I think at some point we would like to get there, yes.
Okay, quick question from Ryan, and then in the middle, we'll take two questions now and then go back to the panel.
So I think, Joppe, you've answered my question implicitly, which may have to do with perhaps one country, one vote and so forth with the forum sec. But I was wondering how you guys are thinking about the scale and the population numbers with, of course, Tash coming from PNG and elsewhere. Are you proposing that the scale and numbers are not, and country size is not incorporated in at all? Where's your thinking at on those issues? Because I think you set it up against the other one, obviously.
Yeah, hopefully you could rank all this and look at the scores and find an aggregate so that they can together from the population, how vulnerable a country is to climate change and the economic development of the status of the economic development in a country, and taken together and you come up with some kind of a score and then rank. But like Tas was saying, we are not kind of trying to say this is how you should do it. We are trying to say there are issues that are more important than just population size. And Australian government should keep an open mind. It's a good opportunity to connect positively, and they should take the opportunity to look at issues that are affecting the Pacific.
Thank you. Another
Just
question?
quickly,
Please.
sorry,
Yeah.
we are looking at particular numbers, but we are not ready yet, which is why Tash joked about some support for us to be able to develop that. We have a whole bunch of data that we've argued about for over weekends and over a lot of cover that we couldn't reconcile, largely because we wanted to make it really look good in terms of a metric. So we're looking at numbers. We can discuss that later if you'd like.
Okay, another question. Please put up your hand if you'd like to ask a question so we get the microphone to you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation. I have one comment and maybe two questions. So let me start with a comment. I think in your model, it might be really important to also cover the social well-being in addition to the economic well-being, because maybe the social well-being is more important than the economic well-being at the end of the day. So coming to the question, I would like to understand how the media propagates this labor mobility. There are different schemes of labor mobility in the Pacific. Sometimes I read, positively on the media, but the academics also a lot of critics. So how do you summarize like what the media is, covering and propagating regarding this labor mobility? Another question is about big data. I think to me, conducting survey and interview is really critical, but since this issue is quite complicated and there are a lot of dimensions, maybe it's really good to do some sort of big data analysis. So have you ever came across to any kind of study that really tries to analyze in depth all these issues using big data? So that's my question. Thank you so much.
I'll probably speak to the media question. Within the region, it depends on who's covering the issues. Obviously, for certain sectors or certain governments that are very much in support of it, it'll be very positive. But of course, when you have Senate inquiries and hearings and things like that, and how people are treated when they get over the other side, it becomes very negative. So it can be a mixed bag depending on who you're talking to and what you access. But generally, to be honest, there is optimism for it because of the financial benefits. In terms of the socioeconomic or social well-being, you're absolutely right. That's one of the reasons why we were really looking forward to Mr. Denton's presentation yesterday about how the 2050 strategy implementation plan, especially for the resource and economic thematic area, is going to be assessed. We were actually curious about that, if it does take in the element of social well-being. And for the data aspects, in terms of big data, that's something that Michael has been tasked with the responsibility of looking at.
No, thank you for raising that. Part of the presentation was because it's a conceptual framework. We want to put it out there and get views like that. So thanks for raising that. We'll think about it. Thank you.
All right, we do have time for one or two more questions. Yep, at the back, in the middle. Anyone else? And one more right at the back.
Thank you so much. So great to see you again there. There was a suggestion that the work that people like the facility is doing now is to come to the Pacific Islands Forum. Did I read that correctly? That things are processed through PIFs? It's one of your recommendations or something?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, so what I didn't get to ask in the last session was exit strategy for people like the facility. They're coming to an end. So I'm interested to know, where did that come from, that suggestion? And why do you think it should come back here?
Okay, I'm sorry. I have problem hearing you, Ariella, but I think that's a very important question. Why do we need to work? For the reasons that we feel that the PEB consults the views of the people, because the program is going to be rolled out using, Pacific Island people to come and work in Australia. So we need to have some leverage, have some say in how it's processed. I think we've the 2050 Blue Strategy maps out the principles and values that we see are important for our region and for our people. And so if this is one pathway that is going to increase livelihood, security, well-being, economic returns for us, then it's important for us to go back to the Pacific Islands Forum to consult their views. As Chope has said earlier with the presentation by Denton Rarawa yesterday, I think that speaks very much to the role that Australia also plays in its Pacific family diplomacy and what say we have in that. I hope that answers the question.
I'll just add to that. When I talked about the Pacific Engagement Visa, I mentioned only 12 eligible countries, including Timor-Leste. 4 other countries have been excluded who are members of the Pacific Island Forum. You have Niue, New Caledonia,
Cook Islands,
French
Polynesia.
And French Polynesia. Thank you. And I don't know if I mentioned it, but we're not in a position really to comment on who should be included and who should be excluded, right? We do have an agency, our regional peak body, whom member countries have joined forces with. And if there's really any place to discuss, I was trying to speak in Tokpisin, but we are a collective community. When we make decisions, we don't make it individually. Even I know that. We all grown up knowing that you don't make decisions for yourselves, Natasha. There's actually your mom, dad, uncle, sister, brother. This is a Pacific family. This is the way we approach making decisions, including policy. So if there's any decisions about inclusion, exclusion, whether it should be country pro rata, giving more priority to climate impacted, we believe that these institutions were set up to represent the interests of the region. Hence, therefore, the rightful agencies that should broker these discussions should go back to the PIFs. And that also applies to Australia, New Zealand, any other partner in the region that is engaged in geopolitical affairs here. So that's kind of like my little say.
All right. Well, I think that's a pretty good place on which to end this conversation. And we are out of time. I wouldn't say end. I think we've just started the conversation about the PEV, but we're ending for now. So could you please all join with me in thanking our team for this really thought-provoking work. And don't go away, because we're going to go right into the next session, which is a sort of a logical follow-on, because the next and final session for this specific update is regional perspectives on labour mobility in the Pacific. I'm going to hand over to Alicia.
Malolele and Talofalava. My name is Alicia Holani. I am from the PACER Plus implementation unit, and we have come to the final session for the day. And it's good to see that everyone's still wide awake and very much engaged. Just to provide some context, in our line of work, labor mobility continues to be an important development priority across the Pacific. But we're seeing more and more, and it's also supported by literature on the migration development nexus, that the success of Pacific labor mobility, as well as delivering increased benefits of labor mobility, really stems from effective collaboration and cooperation, not only between the labor receiving countries and labor sending countries, but also amongst the organizations that are working in the labor mobility space. And so this session is very important, because I feel that level of collaboration starts from us understanding what these different organizations' roles are and how we can best collaborate to support Pacific labor mobility. And so I'd like to welcome the panel. And before I pass on and introduce the panel, I'd like to take this opportunity while I have the floor to quickly touch on the role of the PACER Plus implementation unit in terms of our role as Labor Mobility Secretariat for the Arrangement on Labor Mobility. So as you might know, the PACER Plus during the 20 years of negotiations of the agreement, labor mobility was one of the top priorities from all of the countries. And so we now have a side arrangement to the substantive agreement. And the arrangement is called the Arrangement on Labor Mobility. So that very much frames the work that we do at the PACER Plus Implementation Unit, which is based in I.T.S, Samoa. The countries that have signed on to the arrangement, there are 10 countries, including Australia and New Zealand. The only countries that have not signed on are Fiji, PNG, and the Northern Pacific countries. And we're hoping that they would sign on fairly soon. And the work that we do is funded from the Development and Economic Cooperation Arrangement, which is a 25 million fund that's donated by Australia and New Zealand to support the implementation of the PACER Plus agreement and the Arrangement on Labor Mobility. So just to quickly give you an overview of what we do. So our focus is very much on the development side of labor mobility. There are 4 components of the work program. The first one is in terms of regional cooperation, and this is where we hold forums to facilitate information exchange. And the key one is the Pacific Labor Mobility Annual Meeting, which is the preeminent forum for Pacific labor mobility discussions. We're also hosting regional technical workshops, and I'm pleased to announce that we have a regional workshop on sustainable reintegration in November on the margins of the PLAM in Vanuatu. We're also hosting roundtables to strengthen the Pacific collective bargaining and strengthen that Pacific voice to negotiate regional positions on issues like worker disengagement, solutions on superannuation, difficult issues like that. The second component is on governance. So we support countries to improve the governance of labor mobility, including through support for the development of national labor mobility policies, looking at institutional frameworks. And the third one is looking at opportunities outside of existing labor mobility schemes. And so this is where we look at other skilled and semi-skilled visa pathways to Australia and New Zealand, as well as other labor receiving countries like Niue and the Cook Islands. And so currently we're working on different pilots to look at how we can meet the labor shortages in those 2 countries. And lastly, I think it's one of the more important side of our work. It's on the economic development impact, particularly in labor sending countries. And this is where we work on economic reintegration, skills development, work on remittances, as well as on the social impacts of labor mobility. So just to give you a quick overview of what we do at the PPIU. And now to introduce the panel, our distinguished speakers. We have our first speaker is Mr. Emmanuel Mruisi. He's the head of the Pacific Program Support Unit at the IOM, the International Organization for Migration. And his presentation will be on the IOM's current support to Pacific labor mobility. Please join me in welcoming Emmanuel.
Thank you, Alice. And my name is Emmanuel Mruisi. I'm heading the program support team for IOM. My first PowerPoint was going to introduce So IOM is the UN agency that is supporting member states in migration management and supporting migration and development. At the core of our mandate is to make sure that we are supporting member states and migrants as individuals in terms of ensuring that they have the benefits that come with migration. I will skip a bit of the slides to introduce our organization, but I will also mention that in the Pacific, our work in IOM is mainly according to 3 pillars. The first one is on strengthening resilience to climate change and human mobility. And then the main point of my presentation is on enhancing the benefits of labor mobility, and then also on strengthening migrant protection and border management. And to also just inform you that next week, the Pacific Immigration Development Community will be having their annual meeting in Vanuatu, and one of the main topics of discussion there is how immigration actually can support labor mobility as well. As I mentioned earlier on, our core focus is really on focusing on migrants as individuals. Our main point of departure is that, migration is an individual journey. When a migrant worker goes to work in New Zealand or Australia, they're doing that as an individual journey. And that really has to also support them and make sure that their rights as an individual are protected. We do work with our member states to make sure that they have the right policy framework and they have the right support that they can provide to ensure that they can sustain labor mobility in that regard. The main focus of our work on labor mobility is that we see it as a cycle. When an individual decides to go and work in another country, they needs to have support to ensure that they are well prepared to go and work in another country. And in this regard, in the Pacific, we have started a program to support pre-departure orientation to make sure that workers are prepared and they are well informed about the situation and the policies and their rights and obligations in the country of destination where they're going to work. And when they arrive in the country of destination where they are working, our support is to ensure that they have got the support to ensure that they can integrate in the country where they are working. And looking at labor mobility as a cycle, we are also ensuring that we can support the migrants and also the countries to support the workers when they decide to return back to their country of origin. And this is where our work on reintegration is most important. And our work on reintegration is ensuring that we can support the social, economic, and their legal rights when they return back. And also, this is maybe something that our colleagues from ILO will be able to elaborate. The work on also ensuring that the workers can reintegrate in the labor market system in the country of origin is also important, because that's also how we are able to address brain drain. And if a worker then decides to go back to the country where they are working, we need to make sure that they are also prepared to go back to the country of destination. But all this requires that there is a policy and there is also operational support that is provided to the workers. And here, this is where, as IOM, we are mainly focused on ensuring that the rights of the migrants are projected and are supported in terms of the pre-departure support, but also in terms of reintegration support when they decide to come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Our second presentation is a joint presentation between the ILO and IOM. And I'm pleased to introduce Angelica Neville, who is the Labor Mobility Technical Officer of the International Labor Organization Office, Pacific Office here in Suva, and Ms. Sabira Coelho, who is a Program Manager for IOM here in Fiji. Their presentation will be on the policy brief on climate change and labor mobility in the Pacific. Please join me in welcoming them.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Okay, my name is Sabira and I'm going to be delivering this presentation with Angelica from ILO. Right. Not sure why that's happening. Okay, so this presentation is basically an overview of an IOM ILO policy brief that we published under the auspices of a joint agency program last year. The program is the Pacific Climate Change, Migration and Human Security Program. And one of the objectives of this work was to try to identify different strategies to empower and protect people affected by climate change and disasters in the Pacific region, including migrants. Amongst the objectives, one of the main pieces of work that we were engaging on was also looking at the development of a regional rights-based framework to support migrants and communities that are affected by climate change and disasters. And within looking at the development of this regional framework, this question of how does labor mobility link to climate change adaptation or climate change resilience came up several times. So just with that, I'm going to kick off with some background and then I will hand over to Angelica. So just in terms of the background to this work, and I think this is in a way summarizing many of the presentations that we've heard today, as well as the keynote presentation. I think the work that we were doing acknowledges that climate change will interact with the social, economic, and political drivers of mobility, which will increase the demand for both internal and international migration opportunities. So in other words, climate change acts as a multiplier for existing drivers and can lead to increased risk of people, increased risk for people to be displaced, but also for people to voluntarily seek migration as an opportunity to increase their resilience. But what research has also quite clearly shown is that migration migration that's occurring within the context of climate change will follow existing pathways. So there won't be new pathways per se that are created. And what this means in the Pacific region is that existing pathways that have been established based on historical connections or existence of diaspora will also be continually used by people that are moving in the context of climate change. So this policy brief was developed within this context, and as mentioned, it basically explores the link between climate change and labor mobility. The reason, perhaps also to elaborate on that further, one of the reasons for this work to come about was that as the second objective of our program, we were looking at how migrants and communities can benefit from safe labor migration as the climate change resilience strategy. And this objective meant that we had a series of activities that were working with ministries of employment and other ministries that were actually covering the portfolio related to labor mobility. And what we, I guess, saw in that context is that though there is a lot of labor mobility ongoing in the region, this hasn't necessarily been looked at from the perspective of these ministries as a climate change resilience strategy. So this policy brief was really trying to also come up with tangible recommendations for some of these ministries as well. And it provides basically an overview of the current thinking on labor mobility in the context of climate change. It also discusses the impact of labor mobility and climate change adaptation. And finally, as I mentioned, makes specific recommendations on policy design, labor mobility programs, as well as research. So just the overview of the potential opportunities. So this is, in a sense, our conceptual framing of how does labor mobility link to climate change adaptation. And again, I think these 3 points have probably been discussed in the sessions before, but as a summary, the first argument is, of course, that migration in general, but also labor mobility reduces the pressure from populations, especially in the context of a growing population, and this reduces pressure, especially in environmentally vulnerable contexts. And this is especially important in the context of atoll countries, as well as in overcrowded urban areas. So just referring to perhaps some of the research that was done in a previous phase of the project, the Pacific Climate Change Migration Project, there was research that showed how it was based on a quantitative analysis, but then did some modeling for the future, and it showed that with an increase in population growth, people are more likely to move from rural areas to urban areas, and that will actually lead to an increased amount of out-migration, but that also has the positive impact of reducing pressure on the environment. The second key argument is that labor mobility can also serve to diversify household income at the micro level, but at the macro level can also generate important remittances for economies. That's the statistics from remittances in selected Pacific Island countries, and you can see that there's a significant share of remittances that come to Pacific Islands. Tonga is highlighted there as an example, but as it receives, or at least in 2020, received over 35% of its GDP from remittances. And of course, also important to just flag that within the context of COVID, this was extremely important as economic resilience strategies, so not just one that is relevant for climate change. Within the context of climate change, why is this relevant? It's useful to consider this as a potential opportunity and to see how potentially these remittances can be channeled towards climate change resilience building activities. And I think there is research, for example, looking at the IRC workers from New Zealand and how they have channeled a lot of their savings and remittances into building cyclone-proof housing, as well as in agricultural practices that actually are climate-proof. The last aspect is on skills development and circulation, and the labor mobility provides opportunities in this area, including the development of language skills as well as agricultural skills. And another aspect that is relevant, especially for the future, is the potential for green jobs. So with green growth and the growth of sectors that will be important in the context of climate change mitigation, but also adaptation, there will be an increasing demand for skills in sectors that are relevant to address climate change issues. And so this can also be something that can potentially be taken up by migrants, including from the Pacific region, and then those skills can then be channeled back into Pacific countries. So basically, the potential for green jobs aligns environmental and employment objectives and maximizes skill gain opportunities. I will now hand over to Angelica.
Thanks, Sabira. So I will now be taking us through some potential challenges and then some of the key recommendations that were formulated in the policy brief. And I should premise this by saying that these challenges are just some of the key ones that were identified based on a wide-ranging literature review, and they're not necessarily applicable to all countries or all contexts, but just some that came through. I also think that they reflect fairly closely a lot of the discussions that have occurred in the course of the day. So firstly, there's the potential loss of skills and labour and the loss of traditional knowledge, or the shortage of agricultural labour in some sending communities, potentially during peak harvest times. And I think that this came up in the second keynote address this morning, and we know that there are a lot of big debates already just in the world of labour mobility on the impact of skills strain and labour shortages. And so the relevance here is that if we're looking at labour mobility as a potential policy to pursue for climate resilience, then of course it's important to note that these challenges would continue to be a consideration to factor into these discussions. Secondly, there's the risk of poor working conditions undermining human rights and labour rights. So similarly, if labour migration is pursued as one way of diversifying incomes and potentially contributing to resilience to climate change, then the way that labour migration is facilitated really needs to be in line with decent work, a rights-based approach, and ensure that migrants' labour rights are protected. And this aligns with a sort of broader framing that's actually being discussed at the ILO International Labour Conference right now, or not right now because it's midnight in Geneva, but this week, which is on this framing of a just transition, which is really looking at how you can minimise and carefully manage any challenges through effective social dialogue, so consultation with unions, employers and governments, to ensure that fundamental labour rights are respected in the course of a transition to respond to and mitigate climate change. And finally, ensuring equitable access to labour mobility opportunities. And perhaps, equitable isn't quite the right word here, but in fact, looking at targeted access to labour mobility opportunities that factor in indicators such as climate change vulnerability. Because without that, efforts to pursue, again, labour mobility as a climate resilience strategy would be limited. So these recommendations are very high level, and I really want to stress that I think a lot of the panelists today have in a way fleshed these out or had related recommendations that are a lot more complex and nuanced than the ones here that summarize the policy brief. And I'm particularly looking at our speakers in the front row. So thank you for that previous presentation. So I go through them with that in mind, and I'll try and draw out some linkages where I can. But the first recommendation is to really consider labour mobility as a potential climate resilience strategy, which is, has varying levels of relevance depending on the context, and to ensure policy coherence. So this could include things like ensuring climate change considerations are mainstreamed into new national labour migration policies, or through revising existing policies. Similarly, this could mean looking at migration and labour migration in emerging climate change policies, national climate change or regional climate change related frameworks. So the recommendation is to really ensure coherence by fleshing out some of these linkages. The third recommendation here is exploring options to grant special access and concessions under labour mobility agreements to states that have experienced economic loss as a result of climate change. Today, we've heard two brilliant presentations that both posit probably far more developed approaches on how this could be done. The first was the keynote address that actually looked at how you could rebuild labour mobility programs in light of climate change and really factor that into how we think about the targeting of labour migration and labour mobility agreements. And then, of course, we just heard about the Pacific Mobility Index, which could be another way of factoring climate change considerations into these agreements. So I think it's really brilliant to see these kind of ideas that have been developed in such detail. The next recommendation is the alignment with international labour standards, promoting social protection and worker welfare. This again was a key topic today, and for the ILO international labour standards really can be summed up by looking at the quality of treatment with nationals for migrant workers, things like fair recruitment related costs, and also trying to encourage freedom to change employer and key rights like this. So the recommendation here again is if labour migration is going to be pursued in the context of climate change, such standards and rights should be at the core of this. The next recommendation on skills development, which I think Sabira elaborated on in the slide on opportunities, but really highlights how schemes could try and target skills develop opportunities that align with the just transition and in the future kind of the move towards emerging green jobs. And then getting towards the end here, but looking at improving the use of remittances. So looking at options to potentially support migrant investments in national and community resilience to climate change. And there are some case studies and examples of this, particularly related to housing. And finally, and this is of course ongoing, but this brief was published about a year ago. And I think even in just that year, there's been so much really critical research on this topic from the Pacific region. And so we hope that that research continues. And thank you to everyone here today who's a part of that research community. And so with that, I will end my presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Angelica and Sabira. Our final speaker for today is Mr. Noah Kubak, who is the Program Advisor for Trade at the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. His presentation will be on the key regional initiatives for Pacific labor mobility under the I.T.S. Noah.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Excellencies and officials or participants, good afternoon. As Alice alluded to, my name is Noah Patrick, and I'm the Program Advisor Trade of the Forum Secretariat, and labor mobility is under my portfolio here at the Secretariat. The background is just can I proceed now? All right. And also just to convey our positions as a secretariat to the organizers, the Development Policy Center of ANU as well as USP, to invite the secretariat to just come and provide some reflections of labor mobility. And wait, so I need to check. No. Yeah. All right. So the outlines of my presentations will be more than an overview, and most of you did not know, but the Forum Trade Ministers meeting actually tasked the Secretariat to do a review of regional and sub-regional trade agreements where services, in particular, movement of natural persons is happening under the regional and sub-regional trade agreements. So I would actually just provide a very quick overview of the findings, as well as the objective of the work that the Secretariat is undertaking now, the regional context and linkages to existing work, and as well as the ongoing consultations that we have. Next slide. Yeah, all right. So as I said, 2020, when the Forum Trade Ministers meeting met here in Suva, Fiji, they've actually endorsed the labor mobility as a standing item of the Forum Trade Ministers meeting, and also tasked the Secretariat to undertake a comprehensive assessment on labor mobility arrangements, including under regional and sub-regional trade agreements, and then report back to the next Forum Trade Ministers meeting. So what we have undertaken is that in 2021 until 2022, we've undertaken these the consultations as well as assessment with our partners, IOM as well as ILO, and to some extent as well PPIU, to come up with some of the findings that we find out. And out of that, we realized that there is still an issue in terms of a regional platform of decision-making on labor mobility. And we come up with three main recommendations. One is to have that regional platform for decision-making on labor mobility, but also policy support. And then also developing a regional labor mobility strategy, and come up with a regional information sharing network. I think that's a very important one, because if each countries are actually undertaking those labor mobility arrangements with Australia, New Zealand, but also other partners, there is no such network where they can share their best practices or even challenges that they are going through. But you may recall that forum leaders meet in the special leaders retreat in February this year in Nandi. Now they've tasked the Secretariat to work with all the participant countries. So to hold the additional further dialogues on to understand what are the challenges and opportunities of labor mobility, but also report back to leaders as required. But also they said that we have to be mindful as a Secretariat of certain issues can actually be addressed only at a national level. Next slide. Right, so for the objective of this work that the Secretary is undertaking is that to look at the relevance and importance of development regional strategy, as well as identify what are the potential regional priorities that we can actually discuss within the region, and also come up with an implementation plan in terms of the forecast that we want to look at, whether the short term, medium, and long term. And all this work has to be aligned to the 2050 strategy implementation plan that is now under development by members. And the third one is that, you know, the recommendations on the role of PIFs as a political platform to have this regional forum discussions on all the issues of urban mobility, and also how partners and agencies can actually work together with the Secretariat to undertake this work, but also implementing the strategy or the framework or the mechanism going forward. The next slide. So if I come to the regional context and linkages, I think some of you know that we have a Pacific Aid for Trade strategy that has been endorsed by ministers in 2020 and come up with only 4 main priorities. One is deepening foreign market. And when we talk about deepening foreign market, is more to do with addressing the issue of SPS and TBT, product development, for instance. One is cover, and also trade facilitations in terms of clearance of goods in our borders and reduce cost. Electronic commerce, I think that's one of the very important work that we are doing as well. Comprehensive connectivity, and that's where labor mobility sits in terms of the discussions that we're having now in terms of people-to-people connectivity. And then also the other aspect of the connectivity when it comes to telecommunications or transportations, maritime or air transportations, and then we have services. Next slide. So if we come back to the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent, I think what I can actually share with you this afternoon is that the labor mobility will sit across some of the thematic areas. I think when I look at people-centered development, we talk about people, and we have to ensure that when the people are actually going to Australia, New Zealand, or even the US or Asia, or to some extent into Europe, we have to ensure that the rights are actually protected and that the focus is on the people. I think we tend to look at more economic return, but we tend to forget about the people centered. And then there is also thematic number 4, because that's actually look at the resource and economic development. We do understand the fact that there is a lot of remittances that comes back to our countries. But, you know, the labor mobility it's not one-way street. It's actually two-way street in terms of someone going and rendered services contribute as well to the economy of the receiving states, but also to the sending states, for instance. And that's what we can look at within the context of the resource and economic development. And also the skills that they acquire when they go to, you know, the countries of receiving states. So they come back with very interesting skills and how they will actually contribute as well in creating jobs or even building businesses, for instance. And just take the example of one case that I've dealt with last year. He was a seasonal worker in New Zealand, and he came back and he set up a new business on honey and vanilla. So the only challenge for the person is that to actually market and promote the product. And then what the secretary has done is that to support this, I would say, startup, to give them at least 10,000 US dollars to create, like a platform where they can actually market and promote the produce online, for instance, and for people to consume. Then one of the last one is on the thematic 7, when it comes to technology and connectivity, and then come back again to my point earlier, and that the Aid for Trade strategy. Connectivity has 2 different approach. One is on people-to-people connectivity, but also the transportations, air and sea transportation. The next slide. So I think we have undertaken already some of the consultations with some of the countries within the region. We have Papua New Guinea, as well as Tuvalu, Vanuatu, and to some extent New Caledonia. Let's remember that it's not all the countries are sending countries. We have also receiving states. For instance, we take the example of New Caledonia, or French Polynesia, or even Niue and Cook Islands. They do receiving states as well. It's not only Australia and New Zealand, but also these Forum Island countries. So what we've took out from this consultation is that to look at this regional decision-making platform to discuss all aspects of labor mobility, but also taking into account that there are existing mechanisms that we can also look at how we strengthen them and we harmonize them and avoid duplications, avoid competition, or avoid this, where we want to see that each one are doing something, but at least bring us to one platform, and that's where the forum sits. The second one is also looking at the common standard and also recognitions of mutual, the recognition of qualifications, for instance. I think that's something that really stood out from our consultation as well. Guidelines as well to understand rights and obligations from international treaties and conventions that most of the countries in the Pacific parties to, and looking as well supporting the national labor policies, either reviewing them or either develop them if they don't have it. And what came out as well is that the countries want an intra-Pacific labor arrangements as well to fill when it comes to skill shortage. And I was in Vanuatu recently, and what Vanuatu told me is that we are looking for 1,500 people to come and fill those vacancies, because most of our people went to the seasonal workers program in Australia and in New Zealand. So that's where the Secretariat actually give a guidance to them that you have within the Melanesia sub-regions an arrangement that is already there. How can you, you can start with the island of the Melanesian sub-region, and then you can expand it to the rest of the Forum Island countries, for instance, or Forum members. Cultural framework as well, I think that comes by again has big discussions. I'll just take an example. I know that, for instance, if you take someone that comes from a village, doesn't speak English, I would expect the person to actually understand the language already. And that's where it comes by again to the issue of, if they have the contract with them, better put them in the language that they are comfortable to understand, because they can have obligations and rights there, but they might not understand. As well, it comes to, I think the society is structure where if you have a title within your country and then you go to another country and they don't give you that opportunity to serve as a team leader or something, you're going to create a lot of diversions within the group that you are within as well. And one of the examples as well that I know more than the rest of the island countries is that when they arrive there as workers, and from Vanuatu, for instance, they will see white sheets. For them, the understanding is that that's for when someone died, we have to cover them in a white sheet. So they won't sleep in a room where there are a lot of white sheets inside there. So I think that's something that really comes back into culture. And even when you talk about how you, in accommodations, for instance, you put man and woman in one place. Some of our society in the regions, you don't mix them, because women have their own needs that men cannot even understand. So how can we actually enable that to actually respect that differentiations that we have among ourselves? Remittances, of course, I think that's one that have been discussed as well. Pensions and taxes, it's also an issue. Visas, human rights and social welfare. I think social welfare can come with so many issues. I think all of us sitting here, most of us are following very closely what is happening within the existing schemes that we look at, as well as the database. I think that's one of the issues that they've raised as well in terms of a regional database of information. And coordination, I think it's very important in terms of having all the stakeholders together and strengthening also national labor mobility sending units. Training and exchange of experience, I think that's very important that they've raised as well. You can actually have that, and that's why the platform of network of a mechanism that they can share their best practices that will help as well in terms of exchanging information among themselves. I think that's basically what I wanted to highlight this afternoon, but just in terms of the next slide, it's on the partnership that we are building in terms of having a national labor departments working with the Secretariat, as well as IOM, ILO, Pay Supply Implementation Unit, as well as to some extent APTC, and as well as the other UN agencies. So I think some of like recommendations of these discussions this afternoon is more like building more awareness. I think that's something that we continue to do in terms of making sure that they understand their rights and obligations as workers. Regional guidelines to align to international standards, for instance, promotions of or strengthening the social protections and workers' welfare, as well as the intra-Pacific island countries labor mobility, and also these skills and to address the issue of skill shortage that we are now facing in the region. So I think with that, thank you very much for your attention, and we'll be happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Please join me again in thanking the speakers. They've been very excellent in keeping within time, so we have ample time for questions now. And I'd like to invite the panelists to the front and invite questions. Any questions? Oh. There's one at the left. You have the mic? Yes.
Bola Vani, balance of power. Thank you, panelists, for those insightful presentation. I have a question specifically for Sabira and Angelica in regards to your paper. I was wondering if you had any specific recommendations regards to gender. This is based on our interactions in the community, given that our labor mobility schemes, majority of which are who participate in the scheme are men. So in communities, there's a shift in household dynamics, decision-making practices, and also care burden is more, women bear the care burden. So I was wondering, what are the recommendations? I saw there weren't any recommendations on gender, so I was wondering if you had any specific recommendations on that.
Thank you, Vani, for that question. And indeed, I think it's a very good question. I'm sure there was presentations earlier this week on the issue of gender and in the Pacific, and I think that's something that's, I guess, more generally a challenge in terms of having gender equality, which also, of course, then permeates into the labor mobility aspect. And when we're looking at it from the perspective of climate change, it continues to be also a challenge. There is, I think, again, as Angelica said, the paper is a very high level paper, which makes very broad recommendations, but I think the general recommendation in this area is that there just needs to be continued research and trying to understand what the specific impacts are on different genders, noting that, as you've mentioned, there aren't, the labor mobility schemes are mainly, I guess, the main participants of the schemes are mainly men. And then there's also the second recommendation, which is looking at equitable access to labor mobility opportunities. And I think within that, there also needs to be adequate consideration of all genders in order to be able to participate in labor mobility schemes, particularly again, if we're looking at it as a strategy for climate change resilience. But I'll hand over to Angelica.
I don't have too much to add, but only to note that in the full policy brief, and we should have put the link up on the presentation, but it is on both the IOM and ILO websites for the Pacific. The kind of background and analysis sections do include some more detailed analysis on gender and labour mobility at present, including kind of looking at barriers and the differences in numbers. So it does formulate some recommendations from that. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? Right here in the front.
Thank you all panelists for a very interesting and informative presentation. Actually, I have two questions, one for the presentation from IOM and the other for the presentation from ILO. For ILO, at the end of your presentation, you mentioned a range of recommendations at high level, and one of them is improving use of remittances. And this is something that I totally agree with. Earlier today in Hiroshi presentation, we saw data and analysis related to how households of sending household use remittances, and usually is for consumption. And this is very consistent with earlier research that was done by my team at the World Bank, where we see that the majority of sending household use their remittances money mainly on daily essential consumption, a bit on education, on dwelling and building new housings, but not much on productive investments, such as investing in entrepreneurships or business or buying new instrument for their farm, for example, or expanding their business. So I would like to pick your brain a little bit on how can we motivate better use of remittances so that we can direct that money toward more productive and long-term investment. That's my first question. The second question for Emmanuel is related to worker reintegration. So I would like to hear a little bit more on what specific assistance or support IOM has been or will or plan to provide to workers to support better reintegration back into the local labor market. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So I will jump in on that one. On supporting better investment around remittances, the first thing I would say is that it needs to be community-led and migrant worker-led. So, you know, at the end of the day, if you improve your income by participating in a labour mobility scheme, you should be able to benefit from that improved income however you wish. And I think there is a risk of actually going too far in the other direction and sort of expecting every migrant worker to be responsible for community development with their income. And so I'm not, you know, we're not suggesting that in this policy brief, but really trying to understand where that is the preference of migrant workers to use their remittances to invest in communities. How can that be supported? So for us, I think the first step would be taking a consultation-focused approach that consults with the workers themselves and the communities. And the second step, I think, would be framing it around support and looking at how that could be supported. So starting from this kind of approach that centralizes the preferences of migrant workers, we do know that a lot of workers returning home have a preference to start businesses. And so there's a lot of potential in strengthening support around business development and entrepreneurship training and programs. And there are some pilot programs on this in the Pacific region, which target returning migrant workers to varying degrees. And from an ILO perspective, we would also think that engaging with chambers of commerce is a really exciting area in this respect. There are a number of chambers of commerce in the region who are increasingly engaged on labour mobility, aware of potential skills strain, but also interested in how they could play a role in supporting things like business development, entrepreneurship, and focused investment of remittances. And there are also programs that actually look at climate change related and kind of climate specific entrepreneurship. So there are some examples of this work being done, but I think my key message would be really taking an approach that centralizes the preferences of migrant workers and their communities in how to support these investments.
Thank you, Angelica, and thanks for the question. My first comment maybe on remittances before we go to worker reintegration is that as we mentioned, migrant rights are at the core of IOM's work and should be at the core of you know, the labor schemes. And just to note that, you know, we might see that remittances contribute quite a lot to GDP, but they are private funds at the end. So we need to keep that in mind. When it comes to worker reintegration, from IOM's perspective, we need to look at it in a holistic way. It's not just in terms of worker reintegration in the labor market, but it also has to do with psychosocial support, social integration, because to enhance the impact of remittances in the community, the worker has to have a you know, the social support in the community to be able to make that investment. Your question in terms of what IOM would be working on in the future, we are going to be working together with PESA Plus to support the having a regional workshop to discuss what kind of reintegration support should be provided to returning workers. And our support in that is that it should be holistic, both in terms of the psychosocial, social, and economic reintegration. Then.
Thank you. Yes, up top.
Hi again. Yeah, that was a very wonderful presentation from all the four panelists. I also have two questions, one specifically for Mr. Emmanuel and another one to Mr. Noah. So I'm going to ask the question to you first, Mr. Noah. One of the issues that you highlighted during your consultation with grassroots communities was, what was it? It was on the cultural framework, specifically the concerns around cultural longevity within communities. Let me just preface this to Fiji. A couple of months ago, we had a news report come out where a grassroots leader came out and spoke out against NEC, saying that a lot of the young people, young boys especially, were going on the NEC program, which sort of diminished the cultural work that is needed in the village. So in that context and in the context of your regional labor mobility plan, are there sort of certain provisions that sort of address how this issue of cultural longevity in communities? And to Mr. Emmanuel, probably not to your presentation, but more so the organization that you represent. In your slide, you mentioned that you look at migrant workers' rights, especially in the country that they go work in. There was a workshop that I came back from a couple months ago where former NAC workers that went under the PALM and the seasonal workers program, they came back and they were talking to communities. And one of the things that they highlighted, a risk rather, was a lot of the workers that went under these programs to countries like Australia, New Zealand, they were without work for at least 4 or 5 months, waiting for employment to come. And one of the things they noticed was the system of redress has to go back to the net agreement, or whatever agreement was signed at the time. So with IOM, would you be directly involved in the negotiation of such agreements, or do you sort of act as a police, monitoring this kind of agreements? Yeah.
No, thank you very much for this question. I think when I spoke about cultural framework is that when you prepare yourself to go to Australia or New Zealand, or even within the Pacific Island regions, there will be, issues that the communities have to address. I think that comes back into the community themselves to discuss what exactly that this person has to actually bring back to the community. I know that report that came out that, criticized that the young Fijians are actually going to Australia and that there is no more strong young man's the village to support the village. But then it comes back again to the context of each of the countries. If there is no opportunity within the community or the village, they will look at an opportunity outside, right? How can we address that? Is that when we discuss the opportunities that they can go, but they will come back and contribute to their communities. When I spoke about cultural framework, it's more to look at when they are there, what will happen to them. For instance, if you come with a Ratu and someone that is not a Ratu will actually become your team leader, are you going to actually listen to that team leader? I don't know. I mean, that maybe Fiji's case will be different, but in Vanuatu's case, if you are chiefly family, you go there, they have to know, even the employers have to know that this person came from a chiefly family. So at least having a discussions with them so that they can understand each other. So when there is an issue that come across the group, they can actually address it in a way that everyone is respectful to each and every one of them. But I think during our consultations, I've not had an opportunity to discuss with Fiji yet, but I think that's an area that we can actually look at as well, how we address it in terms of cultural framework as a whole. Not only because the young generations today wants to see, because I have a ticket, I will fly to Australia and New Zealand. But how can they come back and contribute to the development of the community? That's another areas that we can focus on.
To respond to the question in terms of how IOM can support in terms of protection of migrant rights, as I mentioned earlier, our main focus is to ensure that migrant rights are at the core of our work. And jointly with the ILO, IOM has developed global guidelines in terms of how to support countries in negotiating and working on bilateral labor migration agreements. And in this regard, we are looking at ensuring that the sending countries and the receiving countries are benefiting from the labor mobility schemes, but also ultimately ensuring that the rights of workers in terms of their working hours but all the rights that and obligations that they have are also protected. So there is a global guidance that ILO and IOM has developed, and it's available online for use by labor mobility officials from sending countries and also from receiving countries that should ensure that in terms of negotiating bilateral labor agreements, we are putting the rights of the workers at the center. Thank you.
I think something that I forgot to mention to the gentleman is that I think you are talking about the shortage of skills that we have within the communities and the villages. And that's something that, we can actually look at how we can address that. I think that's a very important issue, because as I said in my presentations, when I consulted Vanuatu, 1,500 job is needed. And we don't have that to fill those 1,500 jobs. And that's something that we can really look at and discuss how we address that as a region.
Let's take two more questions.
Yeah.
Yes, the gentleman up there.
Yeah. We are approaching the closing period of our what I can say, meeting or semester. But my point is this: in Fiji, there's 3 universities. This small country, 3 universities. So I think don't underestimate us in the world. Last forum I was here, the ladies, they raise up the entrepreneur. I encourage them to do it, because they will just do business at their various homes. The men have to come out and I can say, do jobs, make this building, somewhat 10-story buildings, and that's my suggestion, story building. And our 3 friends in here, they all, from today I know, I get that they have their offices in Suva, from the Forum Secretariat, the ILO, they both in Suva, ILO Organization Migration, and ILO already mentioned. Those 2, we just have to contact them close. We can just walk and see them. What's the problem? So this, the problem here, sorry to say, my last address, because coming on the financial side, money, the world economy is growing every year. If you want to know, because this meeting, children are born today, more than 100 children. They have a mouth to feed. They have the mouth to feed. They have to go to the hospital. So that's ours. That's ours. So they should, the World Bank knows this. They should just give the money. As I can say, the opposite side, money is growing every now and then, every year, because of this. That's a mistake. Yeah. To conclude, we are now in the very hard situation. Might be, we can say, our friends in Australia, they can just mostly deal with our Papua New Guinean friends. They are bush and they used to carry guns and around. You can see that in Fiji. Yeah, Fijians are well qualified. Fijians are well qualified. 3 universities in this small country. I think yesterday I said that we have 4 sugar mills in the country. 4 sugar mills. Other Pacific Islands, no, they don't have. So yesterday I said, don't stay too long in Fiji. You might have diabetes. They cut 1 leg. Then a few months, another leg. So you finish. I'm not joking. That's what's happening. So to conclude with what I said, these 3 big offices to be in Suva. Please, the Australian, you blocking our ways, please.
Any reactions from the panel to the comments made?
Vinak, Ratu, to actually put some of this issue, like, I think it's good to speak your heart. What is important is that how we address the issue of skill shortage or brain drain. I think that's a very important thing. How can we work together to ensure that we recognize regional standard of how we bring our people to either not only our two bigger brothers and sisters, but outside the region as well. And then they bring back the skills, the knowledge, so that they can continue to contribute to the economic development of each of the countries in the region. I think that's a very important point, because I'll take the example of Vanuatu. We have 15,000 workers working now in Australia and New Zealand, and there is a shortage in the work in Vanuatu. That's why they have to look for someone outside Vanuatu to come and work in Vanuatu to support the economy. And I think that's a very important point. Yes, I mean, as you said as well, in terms of the universities Fiji has, I think that's very important, because one of the issues that we see as well, that yes, they are going out with skills too, but the problem is the issue of mutual recognition of qualification is not there. How can we actually ensure that these qualifications that we receive in our universities are recognized in Australia, in US, in everywhere else? And that can continue to support the economic growth of each of the island countries.
Thank you. I think that's a good place for us to end this session. And so please join me in thanking the panelists once again. I'll pass it back to the organizers.
Hello again. Well, this does bring our proceedings to a close, sadly. Thank you so much for listening to some of the last words yesterday and sticking around. I hope that you did find it worthwhile. So first off, housekeeping. Wake up, this stuff's important. Please do leave by the front, not by the back where the marquee is. And so down the stairs if you're at the back, but please be super careful coming down those stairs. Don't want anyone to slip. The bus will be going from 5 o'clock out here to take people over to the Oceania Centre for the event there. And yeah, we'll be out the front. And we'll be doing multiple trips between here, between this part and the Oceania Centre for those that are interested in going to the exhibition. But note that you'll have to make your own way out of there from there. Now, the more important part, some gratitude. There's a lot that's about to come out. So first off, the sponsors. Sandra and Asia Foundation, Conrad Adenauer, and DFAT, our principal financial sponsors. And I'd also like to give a special mention to DFAT, because the last few weeks we've been tic-tac-toeing, as they like to say, with them. They were very busy trying to ensure some broad representation across a lot of their program areas to make sure that this gets fed back into what they're doing and that they're listening, so, which was very nice to hear and very nice to see. So thanks a lot for coming and for that engagement. Next up, thank you to all the speakers, panel chairs, and attendees. I should mention we had 32 just to give you an idea of the submissions, we had 32 individual slots over the first 2 core days. And if you count each of the panels as 3 individual submissions, which they are, then we've had almost 200 to decide through, which is quite a record number for him, really good. And I think that came through in the quality, which was great. So please do keep up your interest next year. Send us even more. And a special shout out to all the early career researchers and the students who have come here to share their research in progress and to connect with everyone. I really appreciate all your attendance in particular. Next up, USP at large. What a great place to visit again. And the School of Accounting and Finance and Economics for hosting us here. It's been a real honor to co-host with you, in particular for you guys to let us come and host with you on your beautiful campus. Okay, next up, almost getting there, almost done. My own colleagues at DevPol and at USP on the organizing committee. Nilesh Ganda, thank you. Josephine Singh. Oh, we'll go one at a time. All right, let's do it. Josephine Singh, Ronald Chand from USP, Charlotte Bedford, Sharon Liu, who cannot join us here today, but she can hopefully hear us at home, and especially Evie Sharman and Arichika Okazaki, who has been the one that you've mostly all been probably interfacing with a lot. And of course, last but not least, and please do accept my apology that I was not more organized when typing up these notes to get every single one of your names, but all of the USP students that have been helping who this could not be possible without. So thanks a lot, guys. Please join me. I was going to say, please join me in thanking them, but you're already one step ahead. Okay. That actually does bring us to a close. I really hope that you can all continue the conversations that you've had here today, yesterday, and the day before with each other, with us, including through the blog. As Stephen mentioned, we do welcome submissions. And I very much look forward to seeing you all same place, roughly the similar time next year. Binaka Vakalevu.
Good.